Good afternoon. Welcome to the museum on this beautiful spring day. I'm Peter Barnet, curator in charge of the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters here at the museum. We've invited a group of distinguished speakers to talk this afternoon on a variety of topics related to medieval Italian sculpture. Some of you might not be aware that our inspiration for this program is the outstanding catalog of the museum's own collection of medieval sculptures written by art historian and research consultant Lisbeth Castelnuovo-Tedesco with sculpture conservator Jack Soultanian. The catalog was published last fall. We've called our program today Stones of Medieval Italy, and you see the marvelous figure in Carrara marble on the cover of the catalog, but the collection also includes a variety of materials, as you see on the title page on the left. And here, in this enthroned Virgin, acquired in 1998, a rare early sculpture in terracotta, which was probably made as a model for work in another material. The catalog convincingly attributes the work, which previously had been debated, to Goro di Gregorio, working in Tuscany in the first half of the 14th century. In addition to the carefully researched and well-argued art historical entries, the catalog's notable for the wealth of information about the material and the condition of the works in the collection. I show you here a well-known South Italian capital from the early 13th century with comparisons to the example in Troia and the photomicrograph of the thin section of limestone that you see here on the lower right. And here you see an entry on 4 Venetian roundels, or patere. Ostensibly, these carvings are part of a large and fairly homogeneous group, but the marble thin sections seen above show that a diverse group of stones were used to carve them. The studies of polychrome sculptures are an important part of the catalog. Here you see a fascinating 14th century relief of the Virgin from central Italy, the one that was on the title page. The sculpture is made in a molded textile technique that seems to be unique. A radiograph in the catalog that you see on the page open here reveals votive offerings in the interior. And here you see additional images of these hidden details, as well as cross-sections of paint layers and a reconstruction of the original polychromy on the lower right. And finally here, you see renderings of the 5 subsequent layers of polychromy. So with that brief book report, I'd like to congratulate Lisbeth and Jack on their important contribution. I'd also like to acknowledge William Wixom, Chairman Emeritus of the department, who got the Italian Sculpture Catalog project off the ground. And just before I step away, I want to thank my colleagues in education, Joseph Lowe and Sophia Gans, for their help in organizing the logistics of our program today. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Charles Little, who will tell us about this afternoon's program and speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a wonderful opportunity to have such a terrific slate of speakers, French, Italian, American, collaborating today to give you a glimpse of some of the key issues of medieval stone sculpture, primarily in Italy. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dorothy Glass, someone who is probably familiar to a number of you if you've attended any of the programs here in the Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium over the last couple of years. Dorothy Glass has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, but has spent a better part of her professional career as professor at the University of Buffalo. And most recently was the Richard Krautheimer guest professor at the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome. I've known her for many years and a longtime colleague and friend, and she certainly has given us a great deal of insight into major issues of Italian medieval sculpture. Her 2 most recent books have set the launch pad, I think, for some of the issues today. In 1997, Portals, Pilgrimage, and Crusade in Western Tuscany, published by Princeton University Press, and most recently, The Sculpture of Reform in North Italy, 1095-1130, History and Patronage of Romanesque Facades, published by Ashgate Publishing. This afternoon, she will take a wider look at some of the issues of Italian medieval sculpture, what, where, who, and when. So these are some of the issues she'll try to address in a very short summary statement. Dorothy.
Thank you all for leaving the park and coming inside. I was sorely tempted not to. I have been given the difficult, indeed almost impossible task of making a few general remarks about Italian medieval sculpture, a subject that is both vast and varied. In this case, it might be said that too much knowledge is a dangerous thing. The seemingly diverse nature of Italian Romanesque sculpture is in part attributable to Italy's geographical characteristics. For Italy is a peninsula surrounded by the Adriatic, Tyrrhenian, and Mediterranean seas. During the Middle Ages, Italy's vast coastline provided unrivaled opportunities for trade and crusade, but it also exposed the country to regular and damaging invasions. On the seas of trade and warfare, there also traveled objects and artistic influences from the Muslim and Byzantine worlds. In Italy during the medieval era, as today, there was a tendency to think locally rather than globally. This propensity results from Italy's history, so different from that of France. In fact, Italy was not a united kingdom until 1861, and even then, not all of Italy was included. Not until October 1870 did Rome vote to join the newly unified country. That city became the capital of Italy in July 1871. Contrast, if you will, the situation in France. There, during the reign of Louis XIV, which extended from 1643 until 1715, the shape of France as we know it today was established. Moreover, the French considered medieval art to be a highly significant part of their national patrimony. The monuments were studied early and often. Interest in Italian medieval art, on the other hand, is far more recent, for the founding fathers of Italian art history tended to be more concerned with ancient Rome and the Renaissance than they were with their medieval heritage. Faced with an embarrassment of riches, I have chosen to focus on three issues that serve to highlight some characteristics of Italian medieval sculpture that are different from other countries in both their intensity and emphasis. First, the relationship between ancient Roman sculpture and Italian medieval sculpture. Second, the importance of Italian medieval cities and their form of communal government in the making of artworks. And third, the close attention paid to performances, be they liturgy itself or liturgical drama. By the last mentioned, I also mean to suggest a significant relationship between the work of art, in this case sculpture, and its viewers. Let me begin with the obvious. Rome was the capital of the ancient Roman Empire, and hence the number of Roman monuments surviving in Italy is unequaled elsewhere. The pervasive influence of ancient Roman sculpture on Italian medieval sculpture may be examined in three significant ways: the reuse of ancient materials in medieval monuments, the influence of ancient Roman sculpture on the style of Italian medieval sculpture, and the cultural and political reasons for the adaptation of Roman style and content. Christian sculptors and architects regularly reused ancient materials. They were prized for their beauty, their easy availability, their antiquity, and their association with the power and glory of ancient Rome. For example, Abbot Desiderius of Monte Cassino, when rebuilding his abbey between 1066 and 1071, ordered ancient columns from Rome for his new basilica. These columns, the Chronicle of Monte Cassino tells us, were floated down the Tiber River from Rome, along the Tyrrhenian coast, and up the Garigliano River to Monte Cassino. Bonus, abbot of San Michele in Pisa, founded his church in about 1048. Like Abbot Desiderius, he noted in a surviving document, and I quote, "I sent to Rome for the columns of the church, and I brought them here by ship at our cost," end quote. An extraordinarily good example of the reuse of ancient materials in a Christian context may be seen in the church of San Lorenzo fuori la Mora in Rome. Bombed by the Allies on July 19, 1943, it was rebuilt in 1949. It consists of two basilicas joined together, one built in the 6th century and one built in the 13th century. Roman materials were used throughout. In the 6th century basilica, which serves as the apse, we see capitals from the 4th century. The luxurious pavement, made by a group of marble workers known as the Cosmati, employs ancient Roman materials. In fact, the porphyry discs are simply slices of ancient columns, like slicing salami. Most shocking to the modern sensibility, perhaps, is the tomb of Cardinal Guglielmo Fieschi, immediately to the right of the entrance to the church. The good cardinal, who died in 1256, is buried in an ancient Roman sarcophagus that depicts nuptial scenes. The framing canopy was rebuilt after World War II. Even when the artisans responsible for the work at San Lorenzo fuori le Mura exhausted their supply of authentic Roman materials, they still remained attuned to Rome. The Ionic capitals on the church's portico are skillfully modeled on ancient Roman Ionic capitals. Clearly, those involved in the building of the two basilicas that comprise San Lorenzo fuori le Mura both studied and used the remains of Roman antiquity. But you need not venture immediately to Rome to appreciate the reuse of Roman materials. Instead, before you leave the museum today, go to the medieval galleries and look at the portal from San Gemini, a town about 60 miles north of Rome on the ancient Via Flaminia. Dating from the 11th and 12th centuries, the portal is a pastiche of many styles. One of the voussoirs of the archivolt has a Roman inscription, and visible before the installation of the portal in the gallery are Roman inscriptions on the reverse of the left section of the archivolt and on the reverse of the lion bases. And these aren't backwards, this is the way they looked before installation. These materials came from the ruins of the nearby Roman settlement of Carsulai. Indeed, in medieval Italy, countless sculptors went to school, so to speak, on the Roman monuments that were easily visible almost everywhere. The result of that close scrutiny can be noted both in the general style of Italian medieval works and in their sculptors' adaptation of specific motifs. I will offer but one example, the pulpit in the baptistry at Pisa, carved by Nicola Pisano. An inscription identifies the sculptor and gives the date as 1260. The hexagonal pulpit is supported by 6 columns at its periphery and one at its center. All have capitals modeled on ancient Roman Corinthian capitals. Above the capitals stand personifications of the virtues and of St. John the Baptist, while the spandrels between these figures house the prophets and the apostles. Crowning the pulpit are 5 reliefs framed by clustered columns of red stone. They narrate the life of Christ, the Annunciation and Nativity, the adoration of the Magi, the presentation in the temple, the crucifixion, and the Last Judgment. Between the first and last scenes, there is an eagle reading lectern that is similar in type to the one carved by Nicola's son, Giovanni Pisano, for the pulpit in Sant'Andrea, Pistoia. The latter can be seen in the museum's medieval galleries and on your right here. Nicola Pisano's pulpit is sturdy, harmonious, and balanced. Indeed, one versed in French medieval art might ask exactly what is medieval about his work. The appearance of the pulpit is in large part attributable to the sculptor's close study of ancient Roman works. Examples were easily available in Pisa. Many are still preserved there. Time permits a detailed examination of only 2 of the reliefs on Nicola Pisano's pulpit. Let's look at the panel depicting the Annunciation Nativity for general stylistic characteristics, and then examine the presentation in the temple to ascertain Nicola Pisano's adaptation of specific Roman motifs available in Pisa. The Nativity panel is dominated by the enormous figure of the reclining Virgin. She is not the maternal Virgin Mary tenderly holding her child, but rather an imperious Roman matron whose face and headdress reveal her origins. She appears in the same guise at the left of the panel as the Annunciate Virgin. The narrative of the entire relief is strangely disjunctive. Are we meant to read from the Annunciation at the left, towards the Virgin at the center, down to the bathing of the child and Joseph, then up again to the right corner where the Annunciation to the shepherds appears, and finally to the lower right corner where the flocks of those shepherds graze? It seems to me that the narrative structure of Niccola's panel is unclear precisely because he was thinking in terms of individual figures that he had studied carefully rather than in terms of the story that he wanted to tell. Nicola Pisano's propensity to think in terms of the individual figure is demonstrated even more clearly in the relief of the Presentation in the temple. The core of the narrative, located just to the left of center, depicts Joseph holding his offering of 2 doves and the Virgin. They have already presented the Christ child to the priest Simeon. To the right of Simeon stands the prophetess Anna. Head thrown back, she holds a scroll. There are numerous other figures in attendance. The reasons for their presence have been debated. What is abundantly clear, however, is Nicola Pisano's use of ancient Roman sculpture. Compare, for example, the head of the Virgin to the head of Phaedra from a Roman sarcophagus in Pisa. And look at the similarities between the large male figure on the right of Nicola's panel and its source, a figure on a Roman copy of a Greek vase. It, too, is in Pisa. I would argue, then, that this close study of ancient Roman sculpture is not only one of the essential characteristics of Italian medieval sculpture, but also a feature that distinguishes it from French medieval art. Let's look at 2 contemporaneous reliefs dating around the year 1100, one Italian and one French. At the left is the relief of the creation of Adam and Eve from the cathedral at Modena. At the right is the pure figure of Abbot Durand in the cloister of Moissac in southwestern France. The Modena relief is framed and organized by a series of arches and columns, much like those seen on antique sarcophagi, be they Roman or early Christian. The rather plump figures are recognizably human, endearingly so. There is space and air between them. Contrast Abbot Durand. He is flattened against his arch space, itself reminiscent of Roman forms, as if almost pasted into it. His garment forms a wonderful abstract pattern. His head and arms are immobile. It seems to me that the difference between the Italian and French works lies in their relative attentiveness to the Roman past. In Italy, the attentiveness was so concentrated that the departure from that past was not as great. The exception that proves the rule is Provence in southeastern France, an area that abounds in ancient Roman monuments. But attention to the stylistic aspects of Roman art is but one instance of its influence upon Italian medieval sculpture. Roman art was also of interest for its political valence. The example of the Emperor Frederick II Hohenstaufen must suffice. Born in 1194, the child Frederick was chosen as German king in 1196, crowned king of Sicily in May 1198, and crowned king of the Romans at Aachen on July 25, 1215. On November 22, 1220, Pope Honorius III crowned him Holy Roman Emperor at St. Peter's in Rome. Finally, Frederick II had himself crowned King of Jerusalem in 1229. Frederick seized every opportunity to present himself as a world ruler, a Roman emperor of peace like Augustus. His gold coin, the Augustalis, issued in 1231, was an allusion to Augustus. On the obverse, it bears the emperor's name and the caption, Imperator Romanorum Caesar Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. The reverse depicts the imperial eagle. On the screen is the Augustalis owned by the museum, and you can see it in the medieval galleries. Frederick II displayed the same concerns in the fortified gate he had built at Capua, near Naples, between 1234 and 1240. Though now destroyed, its appearance is known from earlier drawings, and hence its form can be reconstructed, although there continues to be some discussion concerning individual details. The remaining sculpture from the gate is now housed in the Museo Campano at Capua. What's left of the seated Frederick II, placed here next to a drawing of the figure made before 1799, shows the emperor clad in a toga resembling that of a Roman emperor. The sculptural decoration of the Capua gate also included busts of two of Frederick's advisors, Piero della Vigniera and Taddeo da Suessa. Both have the physiognomy and garb of Roman portrait busts. Frederick II thus sought to identify himself and his regnum with the imperial grandeur of ancient Rome and her emperors. His purpose was clearly political and served as a constant reminder to the papacy of Frederick's real and sought-after authority. A second distinctive feature of Italian medieval sculpture is closely related to the history of medieval Italy. Here I refer to the early and rapid urbanization of the country. The formation of medieval communes, that is, cities governed by their inhabitants, was engendered by the vast movement of the population from small, self-sustaining agricultural communities to cities, almost all of which had been important urban centers during the ancient Roman era. This transfer of population began in the 11th century and reached its peak during the 13th century. For example, during the 13th century, Florence grew from 50,000 inhabitants to 100,000 inhabitants. In fact, by the 13th century, Italy, deeply involved in commerce of all types, was far more urban than anywhere else in what we now call Europe. City living required certain skills that were not necessarily needed by a rural population during the Middle Ages. Primary among these skills is, of course, literacy. There had to be a sufficient number of literate citizens to run the government, keep the accounts, read contracts, and tally the votes, among other activities. More abstract thinking and the theological speculation of the educated few, usually clergy, were not as much fostered in Italy as they were in the cloisters and universities of Northern Europe. The functional literacy prevalent in the Italian communes is, I think, related to one of the oft-noted characteristics of Italian medieval art. That is, the comparatively large number of inscriptions that appear in a great variety of forms on Italian medieval sculptures and buildings. They appear as authorial signatures, as chronological and dedicatory information, as biblical passages, and as explanatory material concerning subject matter. We've already seen that Nicola Pisano signed the pulpit in the baptistry at Pisa. Let me offer here only one of the most prominent examples of inscriptions on Italian medieval sculpture and architecture. In Modena, the cathedral dedicated to St. Geminianus bears a plaque on its facade, that's the upper one on the screen, that tells us that the name of the sculptor was Viligelmus and that work on the cathedral began in 1099. An inscribed plaque on the apse gives the name of the architect as Lanfrancus. This preponderance of artists' signatures in medieval Italy has resulted in an emphasis on the biographies of individual artists, a trend more common elsewhere during the Renaissance and beyond. Any flourishing city has a prominent and productive artisan class. The communes of Italy were certainly no exception. The labors of these artisans were celebrated in the sculptural decoration of some of the more major monuments of medieval Italy. One example may be seen in the sculptures placed on the interior pillars of the Cathedral at Piacenza. Here we see, among others, a shoemaker, a wheelmaker, a cloth cutter, and a cloth dyer. These trades are most likely commemorated here because their practitioners contributed funds to the erection of their city's cathedral. In this sense, they may be likened to the donors who appear in stained glass windows in France and elsewhere. There are other Italian medieval urban sculptural programs that go well beyond the depiction of the labors needed to make a city prosperous. These works place the labors themselves, or the labors of the months, within an elaborate scheme that embraces local history, ancient history, the life of the mind, and the fruits of physical labor. Among the most famous of these monuments is the Fontana Maggiore in Perugia. It was carved by Nicola Pisano, whose pulpit in the baptistry at Pisa we've already seen, and by his son Giovanni and their workshop in 1277-1278. The fountain is an assertion of the right of every citizen to free access to water as a basic necessity. It is also an expression of the prosperity and civil pride of the citizens of Perugia, as well as an encyclopedia in stone. The steps encircling the fountain lead to the 25-sided polygon of the lower basin with its 50 architecturally framed reliefs, above which is a second basin having 12 sides subdivided and articulated by figures. Finally, there is a central bronze column and a basin supported by caryatids. The lower basin depicts the months. Here, April and May. Each month is depicted twice, once as a personification and then as a labor typical of the particular month. Also present are the liberal arts, here astronomy and philosophy, geometry and music, as well as scenes from biblical and Roman history. Saints Peter and Paul appear on the upper basin. They are intended to associate Perugia with Rome, the Caput Mundi. And there is a personification of Perugia herself, a figure called Augusta Perusia. She holds the bounty of the city and its surroundings. Even more interesting, perhaps, is the figure of Ermanno da Sassoferrato, the Capitano del Popolo, the captain of the people, of Perugia at the time of the construction of the fountain. The Fontana Maggiore thus introduces a political element that, as my teacher John White pointed out, is symptomatic of the increase in the prestige of lay and civic organizations that accompanied the expanding power and commercial complexity of the towns. It is to these audiences that the Franciscan and Dominican orders, both founded in the early 13th century, preached. Similar ideas are expressed on the campanile, or bell tower, of the cathedral at Florence. The structure, standing 84 meters high, was begun by the painter Giotto, who was appointed capo maestro of the Cathedral of Florence sometime around 1334. He died in 1337. The work was continued by the sculptor Andrea Pisano in the 1340s. The sculptural program contained in a series of hexagons and diamonds, is placed on the lower part of the campanile. Casts have been substituted for the originals, which are now in Florence's Museo dell'Opera del Duomo. The reliefs on the west side of the campanile include the creation of Adam and Eve, as well as their first labors, plowing and spinning. Also present are the inventions of Adam and Eve's descendants, Jabal, the first shepherd, Jubal, the first musician, Tubal-Cain, the first smith, and Noah, the first vintner. This expansive program also includes such arts as horsemanship, weaving, and sculpture. The upper reliefs, framed by diamonds, include cycles of the planets, virtues, liberal arts, and sacraments. This vast display of history and knowledge occurs on what is arguably the most visible monument in Florence, located on a site traversed by thousands daily. Let me now turn to my third subject, the pertinence of Italian medieval sculpture to liturgy and liturgical drama, as well as the audience's response to those events. The liturgy itself, by definition, dramatic, takes place in an architectural setting that provides a stage for its enactment. The point is aptly made by a fresco dating from approximately the last decade of the 13th century in the upper church of San Francesco at Assisi. St. Bonaventure, St. Francis's official biographer, tells the story. Having decided to observe Christmas at Greccio, a small town in Umbria, the future saint had a crib prepared with hay. An ox and an ass were brought in. At this point, there was no mention of the Christ child in the crib. The crowds came. Francis, who was a deacon, sang the gospel and preached a sermon concerning the birth of Christ. Thereafter, John of Greccio, formerly a knight and now a great friend of St. Francis, claimed that he saw a beautiful child in the crib, and that Francis took the child in his arms to wake him up. It is this last moment that is depicted at Assisi in this fresco. The liturgical furnishings of the church depicted in the fresco thus provide a stage for the miraculous Christmas service. The scene takes place within the choir. St. Francis kneels and lifts the Christ child from a crib placed in front of the pulpit. It is flanked by the ox and the ass, the altar and the ciboria, that is the canopy over the altar. Clergy, Franciscans, and other witnesses. The choir area of the church is separated from the nave by a tramezzo, or high choir screen. Tramezzi, especially popular during the 13th century, were largely destroyed during the Counter-Reformation. Attached to the choir screen is, at the left, a pulpit, and in the center, a large painted crucifix that faced the worshipers in the nave. Sometimes, in place of a panel painting, a sculpted wooden cross, a carved wooden cross, I should say, would have been suspended in a similar position. The monumental North Italian cross in the museum's collection is just such a piece. Both liturgy and drama demand space and movement. We can imagine how this might work by looking at a Romanesque church like San Clemente in Rome. Here we see a tessellated pavement whose access leads directly to the Schola Cantorum, the low-walled structure variously identified as the choir enclosure itself or the group of clerical singers who sat within those walls. At San Clemente, nearest the apse and shielding the altar, is a simple, restored ciborium that is less ornate than the later one depicted in the fresco at Assisi. Indeed, It resembles a ciborium from a small town just outside Rome that is housed in the medieval galleries, and here you see it at your right. To appreciate the dramatic possibilities offered by this sort of arrangement, one must envision liturgical processions encircling the church and entering the nave and the choir enclosure. San Clemente's Schola Cantorum has two pulpits, one for the Gospel and one for the Epistle. In some provinces in medieval Italy, Campania, the Abruzzo, and Tuscany come to mind, the Romanesque pulpits are adorned with carved reliefs. Two such panels are housed at the cloisters. At the left, the symbol of St. Luke from a pulpit carved in the Abruzzo, and at the right, an Annunciation from a Florentine pulpit. The design of tombs is also a fertile area for the investigation of the dramatic propensities of Italian medieval sculpture. As an example, let's look at the tomb of Cardinal Guillaume de Bray, who died in 1282. Carved by Arnolfo di Cambio, the monument is in the church of San Domenico in Orvieto. Much of the original architectural frame is missing, but it has been tentatively reconstructed. The drama unfolds from bottom to top. At the bottom, resting on an elaborate bier, is the recumbent body of the deceased cardinal. It is framed by two elegant acolytes holding the curtain intended to shield the body. This is still the terrestrial world, the world that the cardinal inhabited. Immediately above, at the left, the cardinal's patron Saint Mark is presenting him to the Virgin, seated above, while at the right stands Saint Dominic, to whom the church is dedicated. Here, there is hope for eternal life through the intervention of the saints. The same concept can be seen in a relief at the cloisters that depicts St. Peter Martyr and three donors. Carved in North Italy and dating from about 1340, it too was once part of a tomb. On Cardinal de Bray's tomb, the heavenly realm is represented by the Virgin and Child. The viewer is led from the mortal remains of the deceased cardinal upward to the heavenly realm presided over by the Virgin. Before continuing the discussion of the dramatic aspects of Italian medieval sculpture, I need to divagate for a moment in order to return to an earlier theme, the reuse of antiquity. Almost 20 years ago, when the de Bray tomb was dismantled for restoration and cleaning, Angiola Maria Romanini discovered that the figure of the Virgin was actually a 2nd century Roman statue that had been recarved and adapted by Arnolfo di Cambio for the de Bray tomb. I show a typical example of such a Roman statue at the right. The medieval sculptor hollowed out and narrowed the back of the figure, thinned the bust on the right side, re-elaborated the head, feet, and garment of the Virgin, and most important, removed whatever attribute the pagan figure held in her left hand. In its place, Arnolfo di Cambio substituted the Christ child and a new hand for the Virgin. This is astonishing, I think. Let us now return to the subject at hand, the relationships among sculpture, liturgy, and audience. There is an early Christian sermon entitled Contra Judeos Paganos et Arianos, against the Jews, the pagans, and the Arians. Therein, various Old Testament figures are called upon to utter words from their own prophecies that were meant to offer proof of the incarnation of Christ. For example, Isaiah uttered, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young man shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Isaiah 7:14. Towards the end of the sermon, such New Testament figures as John the Baptist and Simeon, as well as the pagan Erythraean Sibyl, come forth with their own predictions concerning the coming of Christ. The sculptural depiction of the sermon is fully developed on the facade of the Cathedral at Siena. I refer specifically to the sculptures of Giovanni Pisano, carved between 1284 and 1296, that once adorned the second story immediately above the portals. Replaced by casts, the originals are now in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Siena. Giovanni Pisano's figures stand on a stage-like platforms that protrude from the facade. Those present include both personages from classical antiquity and from the Old Testament. Among them are Plato, Isaiah, the Erythraean Sibyl, David, Solomon, Moses, Habakkuk, and finally Simeon speaking to Mary, the sister of Moses, also known as Miriam. Almost all hold scrolls whose texts predict the coming of Christ. The figures are not, however, passive witnesses. They gesture, they twist, they turn, they engage the audience. The cathedral is their stage. This sort of dramatic intervention at Siena is not seen in French medieval monuments. Contrast, for example, the cathedral at Amiens, virtually coeval with the architecture of Siena, whose sculpture is the servant of its architecture. Thus far, we've been looking at the relationship between sculpture and drama from the point of view of the performed text, so to speak. There is, however, another way in which Italian medieval sculpture engages the viewer in a more direct and personal way. Here I refer to the viewer's ability to see him or herself and to identify him or herself with the sculpted image. An apt example is provided by the pilgrims who pass through parts of Italy on their way to Rome or to the Holy Land. As pilgrims passed along the Via Francigena, the primary route between northern Europe and Rome, they would arrive at Fidenza, a town a mere 10 miles from Parma. As they gazed at the facade of Fidenza's cathedral, they would have seen on the left part of the archivolt of the central portal a depiction of some of the 10 Commandments that were surely intended to urge them to behave properly while on their mission. They, the audience, are being addressed. The message is directed to earth rather than to heaven. As the same pilgrims continued their walk past the facade of the cathedral at Fidenza, they would arrive at the south tower of the facade. Rather high up on the face of that tower is a group of figures that is reminiscent of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. There, the pilgrims could see themselves in the sculptures, depicting people who are engaging in a bit of sexual groping and fighting, among other activities. When the pilgrims turned the corner of the south tower towards the flank of the cathedral, they could look up at another frieze on the south tower and see their journey mirrored by the sculpted pilgrims above who, burdened by their possessions, marched stoically. The group includes one rather spoiled dog who was permitted to ride rather than to walk. As these same pilgrims trudged in the direction of a pass through the Apennine Mountains, they would come upon a small church in the village of Fornovo di Taro. There, on the much restored and rearranged facade, they could easily identify with the figure of the heavily dressed pilgrim carrying his keys and a bucket. A typologically related figure, in this case from Tuscany, may be seen at the Cloisters. Finally, I want to note that the audience for Italian medieval sculpture was deeply involved with and receptive to the activities of their individual patron saints. There is a wonderful example of this sort of activity in the Cloisters. I refer to the doorway from San Leonardo al Frigido. The lintel depicts the entry into Jerusalem. At the right, Christ is mounted on an ass as he enacts Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week. Behind him are the apostles. Although some are damaged, they retain an extraordinary charm as they take part in a liturgical procession. Some carry candles, now broken off, while others carry liturgical implements. Most delightful, many sing with their mouths wide open. At the end of the procession, there is a small cowled figure dressed as a monk. He is none other than Saint Leonard, the patron saint of the church on which the lintel is placed. He personally has elevated his status by appearing in the company of the apostles. In turn, he brings with him the hopes and prayers of the parishioners of this small church who identify with him. Leonard is, after all, their saint, not a more universal figure, such as an apostle. We have had time to look at all too few examples of Italian medieval sculpture. Yet I must conclude. What then can we say in general about Italian medieval sculpture, especially about the ways it differs from medieval sculpture in Northern Europe? Italian medieval sculpture is, I think, conservative in style, at least until well into the Gothic period, when the influence of French art, particularly ivories, fosters a change. That conservatism is rooted in the close study of ancient Roman art. Further, Italian medieval art is in many ways more earth-centered than heaven-centered, more human and less theological. It speaks to the citizens of the early communes as they go about their business in thriving urban centers, and it also speaks to those in rural settings. It is art on a human scale intended to speak to human beings. In 1348, Italy was decimated by the Black Death. When it recovered, it had left behind the Middle Ages for the Renaissance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for that marvelous introduction to medieval Italian sculpture. Our next speaker is a colleague from the Musée du Louvre, Pierre-Yves Le Pogam, who is the conservator en chef of the Department of Sculpture since 2004, and being responsible primarily for the collection of French medieval sculpture there, but he has a very active interest in a lot of other areas, among them Italy. And in fact, one of his most recent publications is on the Les Cités de Dieu, the palaces of the popes. These are the papal residences in the second part of the 13th and part of the 14th century. Most recently, his publication and organization of a wonderful exhibition in Paris was devoted to the early retables, altar retables from the 12th to the 14th and 15th centuries. And this provided a wonderful glimpse into a whole phenomenon of which we saw in Dorothy Glass's talk, of how fragmented elements can be understood when they're looked at in a larger setting. Today, he will turn his attention to the whole question of the genesis of medieval sculpture in museums and elsewhere by simply looking at collecting medieval sculpture. Pierre-Yves.
First of all, I would like to thank very warmly the organizers of this meeting of this day, Peter Barnet, Charles Little, and also other people, Lucretia Carger, Marc Bormand, and my colleague who is present here, Christine Vivet-Peclet, who prepared with me this paper. Is there anything special about collecting Italian medieval sculpture? I think so. I think yes. Or rather, there appear to be a number of distinctive and contradictory traits in this linking for such works of art. It seems to me that this inconsistency, this contradiction, stems from the clearly defined status Italian sculpture have within the greater landscape of European medieval sculptures. As the French poet and fabulist Jean de La Fontaine would say, nous l'allons montrer tout à l'heure, we will show it now. But for clarity's sake, I will give now just a list of traits very briefly, which seem to characterize this fascination for these works of art. First, a steady interest in the modern period, I mean between the 15th and 18th century, for certain medieval sculptures, as the legacy of the past and testimony to a certain social or civic structure. Two, by contrast, in much of the 19th century, there was a less pronounced appeal in Italy for the Middle Ages as compared to other countries. Third, a delayed but spectacular resurgence of interest coming noticeably from abroad. Of course, one is thinking of John Ruskin's Stones of Venice, and more generally speaking, following the initial astonishment brought by this discovery, a rise in awareness and even a national revival in this growing interest for the medieval past. I show you some parts of this beautiful book of 1853. And four, finally, there is an ambiguity. This appreciation for the medieval past is confined initially to a select number of cities, Venice and Florence particularly. And it was considered only as a symptom of the pending Renaissance. For sculptures, as in other media, it was the late Gothic period to which it was given prevalence, a period also described by Vasari as the dawn of a new era, that of Nicola and Giovanni Pisano, and not that of Viligelmo, which we have seen just a moment ago, or Niccolo, or Benedetto Antelami. So, with its strengths and limits, the taste for medieval Italian sculpture has thus existed for centuries, even if it has taken various forms from the church canon, enamored by Christian antiques, to the 20th century collector and merchant. So we will first consider people who have collected medieval sculpture, or at least saved it from the vicissitudes of time. At first glance, one might dismiss this first category as beside the point. Inheritors might be viewed as having no merit in preserving this legacy and might not be considered to belong to the same league as true collectors. However, upon closer inspection, these two categories can hardly be defined as existing in direct opposition to each other. How many collectors just follow the test of time? And how many others, with the means to do so, simply bought en masse entire collections assembled by prior connoisseurs, accumulating objects rather than choosing them with discrimination? On the other side of the spectrum, for more than one era, the protection of all fragments constituted a true struggle against the fashionable. Just let's begin with the symbols of civic awareness. I think that for more than one Italian city, and Dorothy Glass just showed it in a way very clear, medieval times coincide with the most glorious times of the local past, notably because it represents a period when communes claimed their authority and autonomy. Certain sculptures erected at the time for the glory of the local lord, or in homage to a more distant protector, or to commemorate an important battle, were guarded, conserved, and admired as tangible symbols of a civic legacy. A number of works belong to this category, located notably in northern and central Italy, where the movement for the independence of communes and cities was strongest. In Milan, one can give the example of the equestrian figure tomb of Bernardo Visconti, preserved today in the Castelnuovo-Tedesco Museum. You see here the first installation, not in the Castelnuovo-Tedesco Museum, but in the Palazzo di Brera in the middle of the 19th century. So it was a very interesting presentation, but it's not now like that. And here you see the first presentation in the Castelnuovo-Tedesco, where the statue was inside the museum, but in the portico. So very strangely, it was less well protected than in the church where it has been in the Middle Age. So it's very, very strange. But now it's inside the museum, and you see it in the in the presentation of the 50s, a very beautiful one, and I like very much this photo who express the admiration of Italian people for their heritage. In Verona, in the same idea, we find three equestrian tombs of the Scaliger who have been transferred from the outside location in the museum, and you see also all this transformation it implies. In Rome, it was not the Pope who was glorified by a monument, but an outsider who has managed to impose his power, Charles of Anjou, with the Pope, with the agreement of Pope, obviously. If most of this culture represents human personalities, other cities also celebrated more symbolic works of art. And I show here the lion and the griffon in bronze in Perugia that you saw just a moment ago, just behind the fountain Dorothy Glass has shown to you. So there is also symbols. All these works are public in character. They often embrace the status of masterpiece at the onset of their creations, but what is important is that those who have managed to preserve these objects beyond their physical discovery or intellectual appreciation, have placed them inside buildings for their protection. And it is the case also of these two bronze statues. But it's very interesting that in the 60s in Italy, it has provoked a very important debate about the status of these works and the fact that they are in a museum now and not outside on the palace. The second point is the church legacy. The ideology of the Catholic Church is based, as you know, on the very concept of memory. Do this in remembrance of me, said Christ to his disciples during the establishment of the Eucharist. Nonetheless, the preservation of monuments and antiquities was not always performed by clerics. Most often by devotion, sometimes by erudition, or simply by attachment to tradition, occasionally even by family piety, certain members of the clergy saved medieval sculptures slated for destruction. For instance, large fragments of varying significance were saved after the dismantlement of the old St. Peter in Rome. For instance, here, elements of the tomb of Boniface VIII with the gisant itself, and here the bust of the Blessing Pope, probably of the same provenance, so works by Arnolfo di Cambio. But physical destruction was not the only source of reaction of some clerics against the others. Scholarship and erudition was also a powerful influence, especially starting in the 19th century. The exploration of the catacombs, the rediscovery of old churches buried under present buildings, examination of liturgical movable furniture provided ample material for reuse in walls of cloisters and church porticos. This recovery took place notably in Rome, as already mentioned, not only because monuments of this kind were plentiful, but also because it was the locus of an ample ecclesiastical population interested in the history of these monuments. But one finds similar occurrences in other locations, which often brought about the creation of diocesan museums or Museo dell'Opera in many cities of Italy, like the one in Siena or the one in Florence that Dorothy has evoked just a moment ago. I just showed to you the one in Modena in an old photograph who gives a good idea of this presentation, a little old-fashioned mentioned now, but that was a good way to preserve the works, putting them in the wall. Finally, ecclesiastical erudition could bring about slight modification of medieval sculptures, altering their meaning. For example, the study undertaken years ago by Léon Pressuire, my professor, linking the Metropolitan Museum Saint-Hilaire to the Abbey of Galeata in Romagna, demonstrated that the inscription held by the monk here has been slightly altered in discrete sections to make it coincide with its inaccurate interpretation at the end of the 18th century by erudite clerics. So it's very strange because the work is authentic, the inscription is authentic, but it has been very slightly altered to be more conform with the reading that somebody has made of it in the 18th century. It's very strange. Thirdly, in the last category, it's the preservation of medieval works of art by the aristocracy. It should be less significant than the other two, because more than once, the family was the agent for the dismantlement of their own patrimony. When they recovered medieval fragments from their chapels or ancestral tombs, they claimed them nearly carelessly, reusing them as decorative elements in their palaces or villas. That said, reverence for the past and for heritage also lead to a certain awareness for the preservation of medieval sculptures. An interesting case in this point is the statue of Boniface VIII, originally from the Cathedral of Florence. You see him here. At some point in the modern times, it was alienated, and it was located at the end of the 19th century in the hands of the antique dealer Stefano Bardini. And you see it here in the Palazzo Bardini at the end of the 18th century, at the end of the 19th century, in 1891 exactly. But the Duke of Sermoneta, Onorato Caetani, bought it from him in 1893, so just 2 years after. And he then returned it to its original home by giving it to the Museo dell'Opera di Firenze, appunto, to the Museum of the Opera del Duomo in Florence. But in so doing, the Duke probably did not have only the artistic quality of the sculpture in mind, but also another thing, that is, the memory of the first illustrious member of his family, that is, Pope Boniface VIII. So it was in fact also a very filial act of piety. Let us go now to the second part, more important, the borrowed past. And for the first point, I will speak about the role of intellectual movements. After the upheavals that swept Europe in revolutionary and Napoleonic times, the Middle Ages were seen by many as a golden age, a revered period rejecting the age of the Enlightenment. The taste for Gothic times was partly the consequence of an anti-modern movement, Catholic and conservative. In a more positive light, the Romantic generation adopted the Middle Ages as a cause to free oneself from under the weight of the bourgeoisie, industrialized and utilitarian. The troubadour movement never really affected Italy, as mentioned earlier, a possible reason for the relative delay in the collecting of medieval sculpture in comparison to the rest of Europe. On the other hand, Ruskin's writings, and here you have a sketch of Ruskin for Palazzo in Venice, and with the patere, of which I will speak just a little later. So the Ruskin's writings, and most notably the Stones of Venice, led to the close link of Italy and the idea of medieval art in the second part of the 19th century. And it is a paradox. Paradoxically, Venice epitomized the spirit of medieval Italy and the Middle Ages for generations around 1900. This led to a keen interest in decorative sculptures originating from the lagoon and for other Venetian savoir-faire, paintings of gilded backgrounds, mosaic, glassware, etc. There is no need to expand on Ruskin's role, notably on his influence on Isabella Gardner's collection in Boston and its installation within a pseudo-Venetian palace, nor on his own collection, far less bountiful by his wealthy friend, nevertheless containing a few masterpieces which found their way to the Metropolitan Museum's collection. Because all of this is very well studied and published. But of interest is rather the manner in which this fashion for the Venetian spread to a wider circle of relatively prominent collectors around 1900, notably in the case of wellheads, pozzi. In 1858, a new civic water system made the large number of wells in Venice obsolete. Tangentially, this spurred a new fashion of purchasing such elements as decorative touches for gardens throughout Europe. Amidst numerous examples, we will quote so many of them, the André in Paris owned 4 prototypes just for their little garden in the Parisian palace. But the most noticeable example is the one of William Ward of Astor, with no fewer than 9 wellheads installed in his Venetian-style garden of his English castle, Ever Castle, so in Kent. So it was in no use, obviously, for the water, but it was so decorative and he had 9 of them. The same can be said for the patere of Formelle, the reliefs dotting the sides of many buildings throughout Venice, of which, so I show you just an example here by Ruskin, and was been available after certain demolitions or building modifications. For instance, I show here the Venetian courtyard of the Glienicke Castle at Berlin, which is a very precocious example of collecting, since it was built in 1850 for Prince Karl of Prussia. So you see here the patere, for instance, but I don't have the star, but you saw them in the summit of the tympanum. Another sign for the predominance of Venice in the early collecting of medieval sculpture, so at the end of the 19th century, is the case of the Musée des Beaux-Arts of Lyon, the fine arts museum of this great city, the second city of France. Most of the first acquisitions for this museum are from Venice. For example, here, 2 patere at left in 1882, and also a St. George, and also a Virgin and Child. But I must confess that I would, at the same time, one can also quote the remarkable group of the Annunciation bought in 1884 from the same Stefano Bardini, the great merchant in Florence. So, interestingly, this taste for Venetian medieval sculptures was essentially a foreign phenomenon, if we see it. In Italy, the evolution of collecting was perhaps more a Tuscan and Florentine movement, the other favorite city of artistic pilgrimage in 19th century Italy. And really, a true passion for medieval art was developed in Florence and Tuscany. But paradoxically, in Florence, as in Venice, the driving force for this movement was the desire to discover the origins of the Quattrocento Renaissance. Very strangely so, it was not so much the medieval part of it who was of interest, but the one who prepared the Renaissance. As an example, I will quote John Temple Leader, a British politician dead in 1903, who moved to Florence, embracing it as his second homeland and restoring, one might call this reconstruct maybe, the ruins of the Vinciliata castle between Fiesole and Settignano. For this ardent partisan of the past, converted to Catholicism and who pretended to resurrect a lost world, one might assume that the Middle Ages was the center of his attention in matters of collecting. And yet, the oldest works he possessed dated to the 14th century. And they are very beautiful, but you see one here and one here. But there was only a handful of them amidst a much large number of Quattrocento sculptures. And despite their quality, John Temple Leader did not seem to make a tremendous difference between these masterpieces and much inferior sculptures, or even copies in the style of which decorated the castle. So it's very interesting because now do not precipitate to see this castle because it's empty and all the beautiful pieces are in Frankfurt or in Detroit, but now it just remained the fake one. So it's a little deceptive, but more. Finally, one needs to mention a third phenomenon, the infatuation for the Italian primitives. I mean the panel paintings with gilded backgrounds dating to the 13th to 15th century, usually originated from dismantled altarpieces. One should think that they could have influenced a comparable interest for sculptures of that period. Yet, the lengthy and outstanding bibliography dealing with this phenomenon shows very much the opposite. That is, the asymmetry, the non-interest or the very few interest of the same persons for the sculpture of the same period. A phenomenon that, at my knowledge, has not been further analyzed. To serve as examples, let us take two cases dating to the beginning of the 19th century and to the first half of the 20th century. Well known is the collection of the Cardinal Fesch, Napoleon I's uncle. It is known that a mixed over artistic categories were represented in his collection, his huge collection, antiquities, modern painting, etc. He had a keen and precocious interest in the Italian primitives, many of which are now in the Museum of Ajaccio, Corsica. You see here just a few examples of it. He showed no similar predilection for Italian medieval sculptures. Nonetheless, Fesch bequeathed 4 outstanding capitals for the treasury of the Cathedral of Lyons, of which you see here just one example, where he was the archbishop in the meantime. These 4 capitals, Byzantine in style and dating to the 6th century, came from the Romanesque church of San Cosimo and Damiano in Rome, but later went through the Mattei collection. One knows that the cardinal negotiated with this prestigious Roman family for various acquisitions, notably for works of art from classical antiquity now in the Louvre. The 4 capitals were possibly acquired during these negotiations, so to speak, in surplus. But the same thing happened for the collection of another person, and it's interesting to see that it's a very normal process, I think. I mean here Frederick Mason Perkins, a dealer from an American origin, but who lived and died in Italy. A dealer collector, so a figure very quite common throughout Italy, whose bequest to the Sacro Convento in Assisi was a small number, but very beautiful, of primitives, a few dozen panels, of which you saw some instances here. But with only a single sculpture, this beautiful but modest, I must admit, Virgin and Child dating of the second quarter of the 14th century. So it's very interesting to see this unbalancing, this asymmetry. They collect so much paintings, but just 1 or 2 sculptures, because it was also just in the mood. To the game of the market. Beyond these major undercurrents, which belong to the world of ideologies, the tangible role of human beings, notably dealers and collectors who have purchased and sold medieval Italian sculptures, is no less significant. The 2 categories do not need to be placed on opposite sides of the spectrum, as has just been demonstrated. This is perhaps even more the case in Italy than in other countries, such as France. There are collectors in Italy who act as intermediaries and merely play the role of antique dealers. Conversely, one can find in the peninsula a long tradition of Americans who have a collector's spirit, to the point where some of them founded museums or significantly contributed to their holdings. Here I show obviously two very famous people, Stefano Bardini and Elia Volpi. Both of them founded the Palazzo Bardini and the Palazzo del Rinascimento, la Casa del Rinascimento in Firenze. Naturally, there is always a part of speculation in these gestures. It was to enhance the prestige of the works of art were to be sold, to bring praise from the press and from the public, or simply, as for many collectors, to perpetuate their own glory. But one cannot belittle their genuine interest for the works of art they collected. So the examples here are very good, but I should also have speak of antique dealers with more general range of interest, but who nonetheless collected and sold important medieval Italian sculpture, such as the American Joseph Brumer. And many pieces here in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but also in other American museums, come from his collection. So I just put here an example. There is so many in the catalog, so I just pass rapidly. On the other side, looking more precisely at the collectors now, some of them, a few of them, displayed a very interesting, and so I will insist a little on them, and precocious linking for a certain type of medieval sculpture. Collections within villas of the Riviera on the Côte d'Azur, as I should say, around 1900, belongs to this category. In a climate of emulation amongst the rich and even superlatively wealthy, a number of remarkable works were assembled amidst gardens and all residents. Here you see the Villa Torre Clementina, for instance, of the Baroness Stern. Belongs to this category, but I don't have a very good photograph of it. You see just here part of a cloister, but it's a French cloister. I didn't find out the photographies of the Italian part. So I will see more especially another villa of the Cap Martin, just in the same district of France, the Villa Cyprus, which is very interesting. Of course, one can argue that in all these villas, the fragments exhibited in those premises played mostly a decorative function, mixed in with copies, like you see here, and overshadowed by the luxuriant vegetation of the Riviera. However, if one scrutinizes the quality of the acquired works, these collections are far from insignificant, and their accomplishment divulge a true and rare understanding for medieval sculpture prior to the 14th century. The Villa Cyprus, of which I want to speak a little more, has been the object of a thorough research. It was commissioned by a Mrs. Dwin, widow of Mr. Herriot, in 1904, and it was in a very fashionable district, so having amongst its residents a living empress, Sissi, and a retired one, Eugénie. So it was very beautiful. You imagine to have two empresses, just one on the other side. And the proprietor of this villa was not exactly of the same origin, because she was a saleswoman in the Grand Magasin du Louvre, the Louvre Grand Magasin, the storerooms was near the Louvre Museum. She has been the legitimate wife of Mr. Herriot, and so began to have a great fortune. The villa was built so in the beginning of the 20th century, and it houses, you see here, Mrs. Herriot in one of her travels in Mediterranean, and we know by this compte rendu that she bought some things in the art dealers in Venice and so on. It's very interesting because there is a link with what we will see. The Villa Cyprus, very interestingly, houses a number of fragments from Paleo-Christian times, Byzantium, High Middle Ages, and also Romanesque period, mixing the authentic with the copy or pastiche, the original being usually very easily distinguishable. These works were scattered on the villa's exterior grounds, with some fragments employed for the entrance gate. Here you see, for instance, Villa Cypris, so Villa of Venus. I did not explain, but it's very obvious. And you see here that it is part of chancels. It's part of screen chancels of the 8th or 9th century of the Carolingian period. So it's very old and very interesting. And of the same in the same way, these works were also in the beautiful and extraordinary large salon, was just in the middle of the villa, in a Byzantino-Venetian style, as it was the mode at there. And you see that it is really extraordinary pieces, authentic ones, but also decorative ensemble, just to put it all together. And it's very interesting to compare it with the mode of the times for Theodora, for the great Byzantine empress, who I present you the renowned film of 1919, whose sets were designed by the Roman architect Armando Brasini. So you see exactly the same idea of the throne, and here in the beautiful villa in the Riviera. At the end, so, the quality and provenance of the works of art most seem to come from Veneto and the Friuli, is evidence that what might have been a fashionable whim for the medieval world was, in fact, a discerning and adequate collection. And I will just compare it to the portal from San Leonardo al Frigido that Dorothy has just showed to us. You see that it came also from another villa in the Nice district, so it's exactly the same area with the same idea of decorative art. But what a decorative art! It's so sumptuous that it can now ornate a great museum as the Met. Finally, I will speak of the specific approach of these works of art, I mean of the medieval Italian sculpture. For obvious reasons, works emanating from monuments are fewer in number than those defined as movable property. Likewise, fewer wooden objects remain in comparison to those in marble or stone. But such an observation is not so exact for Italian sculpture. And I think so for two reasons. First, because the division between a monumental object and a movable property is not as clear-cut as in other Western countries. For example, many works embellishing portals in Italy are structurally independent from their architectural context, and that is also a difference with French medieval art. Second, many regions in the peninsula are prone to earthquakes, as we know. Thus, more than one monument has been affected by them and eventually ends up being dismantled. The fragment of the Avezzano lintel from Abruzzo at the Louvre is one such example. All the more striking as the traces found on the basin belonging to the Metropolitan Museum, a fact which is evoked in the beautiful catalogue of the Metropolitan. And so I think it's very interesting to see that there is this cause is very important. On the other side, certain types of work were collected more than others, simply by taste. Amateurs generally preferred acquiring sculptures of the Virgin and Child rather than of a crucified Christ. But there are also groups of the Annunciation who are very appealing to the taste. And from the Trecento and early Quattrocento Tuscany, many of them came to museums. For instance, here one in Paris. But unfortunately for the Annunciation, because it is groups, especially, monetary gain would sometimes lead to the separation of the angel from the Virgin. For instance, here the Virgin is in the Louvre, but the angel is in the Cluny Museum. So two Parisian museums, but on each side of the Seine. In other case, happily, fortunately, other sculptures fared better. For example, here the Annunciation group is totally in the Louvre. The group is preserved in its entirety. Of course, fragments rather than whole works of art are generally found in greater number also. Even for sculptures or furniture, amboss, medieval pulpits are generally found as partial elements, a corner statue, parapet relief, decorative detail, salvaged from their dismantlement during liturgical reforms. And for instance, I will show here in this category the statuette of Saint Dominic from an altarpiece, another type of liturgical important furniture. In this case, originating from the altarpiece by Giovanni di Balduccio, probably from Saint Dominic in Bologna. Today, at the Museum Grobel-Abadie in Marseille, by parenthesis, it's also a museum founded by a woman. The women have a very, very important role in this collecting of medieval sculpture, and especially Italian. And I don't know why, but maybe because it's Mother's Day, but I don't know. And so today it's in a museum, and you see that the type of work collected originally an independent sculpture, or one made independent, as in this case, matches quite well with the modern definition of a sculpture. That is, a distinct work of art in marble or wood, not an element of larger ensemble. But this leads to a fragmentary and mainly erroneous vision of medieval sculpture, because you know that these examples came from this great altarpiece. I show you here just a tentative reconstruction of this altarpiece, but you understand that it's a very different thing to have just this statuette and to understand it as a part of an ensemble. So it's a problem to have this erroneous vision of medieval sculpture, a problem described very well by Charles Little in the beautiful exhibition Set in Stone in the case of medieval aids. This exhibition was here some years ago. Another point is maybe the problem of Romanesque culture. One would like also to underscore, it's the final characteristic of my discourse, the problem of perception of Italian medieval sculpture in 19th and 20th century. We have seen that an old passion for the early Middle Ages has existed. And on the other side, that the Trecento was particularly prized and collected by these same amateurs, not only for its intrinsic interest, but also for its place under the banner championing the start of Italian Renaissance. So, medieval works of art located in the middle of the chronological spectrum solicited less curiosity. Although, in sensu stricto, medieval, since they belong to the middle centuries of the Middle Ages, I mean Romanesque and 13th century, these works of art are far less well represented in private collection or public institutions. And I illustrate here one example in the Louvre, but it's just an exception. The Louvre is very bad representation of these works. So I am very jealous because I mean in the Metropolitan Museum it's much more balanced. There you have a very good important range of Romanesque art, but it's very uncommon, I mean, and it's very interesting to understand it. So I would say that it can be understood in this regard as if we take the example of talented forgers, of which deceptions can often act as good barometers in the history of taste. Takes us the famous Alceo Dossena affair, who immediately comes to mind. Unaware that his various dealers in Italy marketed his creations, Dossena was possibly not truly a forger, but it's not very clear. In either case, his duplications or pastiches of 14th century sculptures, as an example, I show here the Virgin in the style of Giovanni Pisano, acquired by the Museum of Art in Cleveland in 1924, but returned by the museum after the scandal exploded. This type of sculpture, as much as those of Quattrocento works, have fooled more than one specialist, just as these talented imitations of classical sculpture. Interestingly, Dossena seems much less at ease when he tried to duplicate the style of his middle medieval period. His works à la manière of Benedetto and Tellamy are much less convincing, at my advice, than his overproduction, not only because of incongruities in the iconography. You see, the Pietà is very strange for 12th century, but also simply because of style, because even though they might appear to imitate such and such elements of sculptures from Parma, where Dossena once lived, it's not very convincing. You see, it's very poor. But so it is thus most remarkable when there is those collectors, merchants, or public institutions who took interest specifically in the acquisitions of works from this middle period. Naturally, this might just have been fortunate circumstances, particularly for antique dealers. For example, Georges and Lucien de Motte, active in Paris and New York only for a short period of time, about 1910, 1930, but of great influence on the medieval sculpture market, acquired a group of reliefs from Bologna from the Romanesque period, unfortunately dispersing them throughout their bequest to various American museums, probably to solicit the gratitude and interest of these museums. Does their acquisition prove a prescient awareness for such art? Unfortunately, it's not sure. And the research on these two dealers planned in conjunction between the Louvre and the Metropolitan Museum will probably help answer this question. But in specific cases, so I will show you, just use the beginning of our research. But in specific cases, the acquisition of a Romanesque work of art stemmed without doubt from a conscious decision. The Musée des Beaux-Arts of Lyon purchased in 1938 a capital with the infancy of Christ relating to the style of 12th century Modena. It belonged to the collection of Arthur Sambon, an expert in Paris, and before then to the Florentine antique dealer Stefano Bardini. Those are major figures already mentioned, as you remember. And it is significant that the acquisition of this Romanesque capital was undertaken at a time when the Musée de Lyon was under the directorship of René Julien, a specialist in Italian art, who published a major book on this topic in 1945, after much research on Italian Romanesque culture, a book which is very old-fashioned now, but was important in his time. So, to conclude my discourse, I would say that with the merchants and the collectors, the curators and academics do play a major role, not only in the knowledge, but also in collecting Italian medieval sculpture, as is sufficiently proved by the magnificent collection of the Met in this domain and by the impressive catalogue who has been published on it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Yves. That gives us a wonderful grounding, I think, in understanding how things migrate from Italy to institutions like the Met and other American museums and collections. This afternoon, we're going to turn our attention to the substance, the real substance of some of the works of art that we've been looking at. And Professor Lorenzo Lazzarini, professor of the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Venice, where he has taught for many years and is one of the key specialists in identification of stone, especially marbles, of Italy and of the Mediterranean basin. His work on San Marco of Venice and stones of that great monument, the identification of stones from the Eastern Mediterranean, and recently he's been working on the Renaissance stones of Venice as part of his research projects. Among his many publications are various projects connected to the interdisciplinary studies on ancient stone and how they are identified. This afternoon he will turn to his homeland, to Venice, and speaking on the stones of medieval Venice. Lorenzo.
Thank you, Charles, for your kind introduction, and many thanks to all the organizers for their invitation. Actually, I have to apologize about the title of my talk, which is very ambitious. I should say that I will concentrate on the most important stones of medieval Venice, and I hope to give you an overview of them. And I will start by showing a map of the Roman settlements, the Roman towns of northern Italy. As you well know, the birth of Venice is directly connected to the death of many Roman towns. I should mention Batavium, the modern Padua, and then Concordia, modern Portogruaro, Opitergium, modern Oderzo, Aquileia, and especially Altinum, modern Quarto d'Altino. All these towns were mostly evacuated from their inhabitants due to the invasions, the barbarian invasions, starting in the middle of the 5th century AD. Actually, we have a birthday of traditional birthday of Venice, which is the 25th of April, 421. But it is just a tradition. There are no documents, nor archaeological evidences for this birth. We know for sure that Venice was inhabited in the Roman times, most probably by fishermen and huntsmen. And very recent investigation, especially concentrated in the northern part of the lagoons, have taken to light several houses with remains of solid brick walls, sometimes with stones. And the stones that have been found are mostly of the Veneto region, limestone from Vicenza and from Verona. But we know that the settlements were much more numerous, and at very beginning, the settlements were not very different from what is shown in this drawing. So they were mostly made of wooden structures, wooden straw and canes, and this type of buildings are very traditional and are still existing and are documented throughout the centuries, as you may see, for example, by Vittore Carpaccio in this famous painting preserved in the Getty Museum. As you may see here, there is a typical casone, and some casoni like this are still existing and in use, in the, especially in the southern part of the lagoon of Venice. But we know that the first centuries of life of Venice were very difficult. There are several writers, Cassiodorus, for example, or Paulus Diaconos, reporting that in the late 5th century and throughout the 6th century AD, there were many big floodings of the lagoon, and life there was really very difficult. So it is only from the 7th century that Venice started to grow. And we have in this period probably the first solid buildings that were using spolia, especially taken from Altinum, which has to be considered the real mother of Venice. In this photo you have what is still remaining of one of the towers of the town walls of Altinum. We know that the town walls were 3.5 kilometers long, and very little is remaining of these town walls since the all the stone was taken, most of the stone was taken by the Venetians and used for the foundations of the very early buildings. This pillaging continued over the centuries, and we have, for example, that the Rialto Bridge is paved with the same stone, which is a Miocenic sandstone, quarried in the area of Vittorio Veneto, so northwest of Venice. It is a stone that is very easy to work, and it is especially good because it is very compact, and it has been, that is why it has been used to make a barrier for the rising water of the Venetian buildings. Altinum was a very wealthy town, and this is demonstrated also by the presence of many precious colored stones. Very few are remained because the Venetians took them all. And you have here one of the few domos, the few houses, still with precious marbles in situ. You may see here what is called Bardiglio di Carrara, so it's a marble from the Carrara area. Here you have Breccia di Sette Basi from the island of Skyros, and this is Fior di Pesco limestone from Eretria, from the island of Euboea, also in Greece. And then you have Thasian marble here, and also Thasian marble, which was probably the base for a statue, insisting on a tondo of Africano, which is a breccia from southwest Izmir in Turkey. This stone, all these stones were, of course, imported, especially in the first centuries of the Roman Empire. And there has been systematic pillaging, not only from Altinum, but also from other towns. For example, Patavium, which was also a very rich town, has very few colored marbles left, because most of these marbles took their way to Venice. And we find all these materials, especially in the 12th century floors, starting from the beautiful floor of St. Mark, the St. Mark's Basilica. Here you have an example of the most, the well-preserved part of the main floor, which shows a beautiful tondo of Breccia Corallina. This is a stone from Bithynia, so from northwestern Turkey. But you may also see the red porphyry, the green porphyry, and many other types of stones. In this floor, there are more than 60 different types of stones, mostly coming from all the provinces of the Roman Empire, so from Turkey as well as from Greece, Egypt, and so on. And the same materials you may find in other 12th century floors, like the one of San Zaccaria, that of San Salvador, San Lorenzo in Venice, or San Donato of Murano, and Santa Maria Assunta in Torcello. And here you have an example again from St. Mark, and you may identify here Marmor Chium from the Greek island of Chios, together with Venetian, say Veneto, stones like the Veronese limestone. And in here, you have a beautiful tondo of Lapis alabastrites, a calc sinter, a travertine from Middle Egypt. The Venetians took not only the sandstone of Altinum and the beautiful colored marbles, but also statues, and they transformed them into, you see, saints. For example, here, what was probably the statue of a Roman emperor, Loricatus, has been transformed into Agios Theodoros, Saint Theodore, a Byzantine saint. And this other one, Togatus, has been transformed in the Gothic period into St. Paul. And you may visit in Venice, you may find many other reused examples of Roman stones. Here you have a beautiful funerary stele made of, like the column here, of Aurigina limestone, which is the most important stone of the northwestern part of the Adriatic coast. And I will tell you more about this stone in a moment. The most ancient building which reached us is for sure the crypt of the St. Mark's Basilica. You know that the body of St. Mark was transported from Alexandria to Venice in 828, and immediately started the construction of the Basilica, which was inaugurated by Giovanni Partecipazio, the Doge, in 832. And in this part, which is the oldest one of the Basilica, you have also reused materials, Proconnesian marble here, also very important for Venice, and Cipollino Verde, which is a stone which takes its name from the fact that it looks like a sliced onion, but it is coming from Euboea, again from the Greek island. We don't know exactly of what was made the sarcophagus, the original sarcophagus of St. Mark. It was most probably made of Verde Antico, so also an important stone used in Roman antiquity and connected to a symbolic meaning. The green is the color of resurrection, and that's why, for example, Verde Antico was used as a substitution materials for the porphyry. When in the middle of the 5th century AD, Egypt was not any longer, let's say, used for taking stones and metals. The quarries of the Mons Porphyrites were abandoned, and the porphyry was not any longer quarried, exploited. That is why the Verde Antico was used instead of the porphyry as sarcophagi, the imperial sarcophagi in Constantinople. I had the chance to examine the cores that were made when the crypt was restored to insulate this part of the basilica from the acque alte. And examining the cores, I found many different types of materials, precious materials sometimes, like Parian marble, pentelic marbles, and also this very rare Egyptian granodiorite coming from the Fawakir area, the eastern desert. And this is a clearly testifying for the reuse of ancient Roman stones and marbles. We know from documents that many of these precious marbles and stones were also coming from Aquileia, and it has been possible to verify that this is correct by measuring the columns. These columns, there are 8 columns like these in the narthex of the St. Mark's Basilica, and they have the same quality of stone and the same dimensions of the columns that you see here in the Grado Cathedral. The stone is what the Roman called marmor Celticum. It's also known as Aquitanian marble, since it was quarried at Aubert in the French Pyrenees. And this stone was most probably, all these columns were most probably all belonging to a late Roman building in Aquileia that was dismantled, and part of the columns were sent to Venice, and another part were reused in the Grado Cathedral. But the transformation of Venice from, let's say, spread village of wooden houses with a few public buildings made out of reused brick and stones took place starting from the 11th century AD. And the need for good quality material made the Venetian to force the Venetians to reopen the quarries of the Aurigina limestone I mentioned before. You see here the aspect of this material, which is a fossiliferous limestone. Actually, these are all small fragments of larger fossils called rudiste, typical of the Cretaceous. And the fossils are the one that you see here under polarizing microscope. So they look like as small shell fragments embedded in a micritic microcrystalline calcite matrix. This stone is a very good quality, and it was much distributed in Roman times, say from Trieste and the Istrian Peninsula to Milan in the west, and to Rimini and Ancona to the south. And it is particularly abundant in Venice, either as reused materials, and you have an example here of a sarcophagus, or as newly cut sarcophagi like the one that you see here. There are two qualities of Aurigina limestone. This one is the most common, and it is called Roman stone. It's characterized by small fragments of fractured and reconsolidated fragments of rudist. And the second quality is called the fiorita, flowered, which is more well-preserved fossils that you may notice in this sarcophagus. So there is quite a large amount of Aurigina limestone dating to the 11th and 12th century that was used, for example, for carved slabs, or for these lions, for cornices, as I will show in a minute. This Aurigina limestone is so abundant in the 11th century that it cannot be only spolia, coming from spolia. So I think that a good amount of these materials was carved in the late medieval period. And here you have a view of the huge quarries dating to the Roman medieval times. The quarries have been reopened at the end of the 19th century, and they are still producing the stone, which is much used again in the Veneto area. So the Venice from the 12th century on need, of course, a large amount of stones to decorate its building, but also to build the most important public buildings. And it used very much their merchants' ships to import stones especially from the Levante. You have in this map the most important sea routes, and they were called galeae from the name of the ships. And you see that the most important one is the Galea di Romagna, that was going, of course, to Constantinople and to other destinations in the Black Sea. Then very important was the Galea di Syria, connecting with the Near East, that of Alexandria, and Galea di Trafego, it's a traffic galea, which was very important because it connected, as you will see, the Near East with other locations in present-day Libya, in the Maghreb. The Venetians exported heavy materials, namely salt, metals, timber, and they came back with light materials, spices, textiles, gems, and other precious materials, precious pottery, and so on. And they had the need to balance their ships. That's why it was very convenient for Venice to load the ships that you see here with already worked and already sculpted stones and marbles. And this has been a common practice throughout the history of the town. A very important date for Venetian stones is 1204. As you know, the Venetians were asked to carry the Crusaders to Jerusalem, but they obtained a diversion. They first diverted the fleet to Constantinople that was conquered, and the Venetians, together with the Latins, remained there almost 60 years, so they had all the time to pillage and spoliate the important Byzantine buildings from their marbles. And much of the marble that are present in the St. Mark's Basilica are of Constantinopolitan origin. It has been calculated there are more than 400 columns and more than 400 capitals of Constantinopolitan origin. And you have here a few examples of the beautiful stones that were removed from the capital of the Eastern Empire. Here you have the porphyry from the desert, from the Mons Porphyrites. Somebody has made the hypothesis that these columns were originally in Rome and they moved from Rome to Constantinople. What it is sure that the other columns that you see here, again of Aquitanian marble, moved from the Pyrenees to Constantinople, and then they were taken by the Venetians back, halfway back to Venice. There are more than 23 columns of this marble in the Basilica, but all the other marbles are of Constantinopolitan origin. The arches were sculpted in Venice, but they are made of Proconnesian marble, which, as we will see, is the most important marble of medieval Venice. Here you have other examples of important and beautiful stones reused in the Basilica. There are pieces like this beautiful sigmoidal tabletop made out of rosso antico. This is the marmor Taenarium of Roman antiquity. It was originally quarried on the tip of the Mani Peninsula in Greece. And this stone has been largely used in the Roman period for facing, but also for sculpture. Then you have beautiful marmor Iasense. This is called Cipollino Rosso. So it always used as a pandan or Cipollino Verde. They are used together. But this is of Turkish origin. It's coming from Caria, from Yazos in the north and southern western part of Turkey. And they are all on a green background of Verde Antico, Marmor Thessalicum from Thessaly, northern middle Greece. Another beautiful example of decoration with precious marbles you have inside the basilica, where, as you may see, Proconnesian marble as well as Cipollino Rosso and other marbles were cut from the same block, and then the slabs were fixed in a way to give this beautiful drawing, this nice pattern. It's called a macchia aperta in Italian. And all the outside and inside of the basilica is faced with this material cut in this very particular way. Proconnesian marble was also used for the columns, and it is, as I said, the most important marble of medieval Venice. It is the most abundantly used in Venetian buildings until the beginning of the 15th century. When around 1420, the Lamberti family, a family of Tuscan sculptors, arrived in Venice, and they took Carrara marble, which then became the most important for the following centuries. Proconnesian marble is really very abundant in Venice. It was called marmor Cisdicenum in Roman times, taking its name from Cyzicus, the present-day Erdek, which is in this part of the peninsula, small peninsula on the Sea of Marmara. The Proconnesian marble takes its name from the island of Proconnesos. It is Marmara now, a toponym clearly indicating that more than half of the island is made out of marble. The upper part of the island is made of this marble. Here you see a photomicrograph of a thin section of this marble, which is very characteristic and can be identified quite easily under the microscope. This marble, Proconnesian marble, has been used also for sculptures. The patere you see here are very typical. It's a unique feature of Venice, and they are very abundant. More than thousands of them have been identified in Venice and spread all around the world in several museums. They are representing zoomorphic or phytomorphic subjects, and they were obtained by slicing, like salami, as it has been said for other stones before, columns. And in fact, Proconnesian marble was much reused in this way, but also in the other way around. So it was sliced parallel to the length of the column to get slabs. Proconnesian marble was also used for sculpture, like the small Virgin and Child that you see here, which is in a lateral portal of the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine. And this is a sort of puzzle that has been produced in the late Gothic period. And in fact, you have not only Proconnesian marble, but also Cornish, one of the Cornish I mentioned before of Auresina limestone, which is, Cornish is like this, are very common in Venice. So after the Fourth Crusade, a large amount of stones arrived in Venice, and this has been, this amount has been used over the century to decorate the Ducal Palace. We should remember that the Basilica was the private chapel of the Doge, so the Doge has access to these materials, and in fact the Ducal Palace, as we will see at the end of my talk, has been decorated with all the most important Romanesque and Gothic and Renaissance stones. To justify what I'm saying, that the amount of stone imported was very large, you may see that the capital, which is dating to the 14th century, is also showing beautiful colored marbles, again the Aquitanian marble and the Phrygian marble from central Turkey, again the Chian marble, and this beautiful column of what was called Marmor Tiberianum. It's a diorite from the eastern desert. There is still a certain amount of stones and marble taken during during the occupation of Constantinople, available for restorations in the storerooms and on the lapidary of the St. Mark's Basilica. Venice also used the spolia of the Byzantine period, and here you have two nice examples. The beautiful tondo, dating to the late 12th century, also Proconnesian marble, and these large, huge tondos of the red porphyry, the Egyptian porphyry, and the Greek porphyry. These were most likely they were installed originally in important Constantinopolitan buildings, maybe in the imperial palaces. In fact, these are among the most precious stones of antiquity. They are both mentioned in Diocletian's edict, dated 301, as the most expensive materials, 250 denarii per cubic foot. This amount of money were equivalent to 35 grams of pure silver, so a large amount of money for small blocks, small pieces of these precious materials. Here is another example of Byzantine high relief reused in the church of San Polo. And moreover, the Venetian took from the Byzantine world also the typical, they are most important and most beautiful palaces, facades of palaces and houses. Here you have two examples, the Caloredan. All the columns here are made out again of Proconnesian marbles, but the background is Verde Antico, and the small arches are made out of Lumachella, so a fossilifero limestone called Marmor Triponticum in Roman times, also coming from Bithynia, from northwestern Turkey. And here you have another example of a recently found Veneto-Byzantine house. This is how they are called, this type of building, mostly dating to the 12th, 13th century. And in this part of you have the combination of local stone, let's say local from the Veneto region, the Veronese limestone with Proconnesian marble and Aurisina limestone. Most notable is the presence also of Istrian stone. This is the most important, the most abundant, frequently used stone of Venice. It's called Istrian stone because it was coming from Istria. And this stone arrived in Venice in the second half of the 13th century, not before, in spite of the fact that it is a good material. In fact, it's a very compact, we can call it lithographic limestone. You may see here its aspect when it is of good quality, and the correspondent thin section aspect, microscopic aspect of a thin section. It is a very dense limestone that has been largely used for architectural elements and also for sculpture. Sometimes it is not of good quality, so as you may see here, it may be porous, and it is only in poor buildings that this quality is found. In any case, the Istrian stone arrived, as I said, in the second half of the 13th century, and here are two, the oldest examples, together with the columns I showed, of the use of these materials, which is originating from the western part of the Istrian Peninsula. Here you see a geological map, and the outcrops are corresponding to the dark blue colors in here. The stone was forming from the lithification, consolidation of a calcareous mud forming in a back reef or in a lagunar area like the one shown here. The largest quarries are at Orsera, Vrsar, now in Croatian. Here you see the village with the cathedral, and here is another view of the Orsera quarries. This is really a huge quarry. I've calculated that more than 1 million cubic meter of stone has been exploited in this locality. And here is the other big quarry, that of Rovigny. And this is also a very huge quarry. The quarry front is over 300 meters long. And here approximately 700,000 cubic meters of stone has been taken. Istrian stone was, of course, largely used after the 13th century. It was initially for the contours of doors, lintels, or windows, also sometimes for statues. Then it was largely employed in the late Gothic architecture, and the best example is, of course, the Ducal Palace. Later on, in the Renaissance period, by Palladio in the Redentore, the Redeemer Church. Then by Longhena in the Baroque period for the Salute. And in 18th century and 19th century, in this beautiful neoclassic Palatina del Sarti. So it is in this period that Istrian stone, especially in the Baroque period, that Istrian stone was largely used for facing the walls, of the facades of the most important private and public buildings. To conclude, I would like to show this map that is about the presence of stones and marbles in the Ducal Palace that, as I said, is possibly the best. It is a sort of summary of all the stones present in Venice. In fact, you may find there are stones coming from Egypt, from Asia Minor, all these places in Asia Minor and Greece, and of course some from Northern Africa, and one from France, the Rosso Antico, the Rouge Languedoc, and several from Italy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I find that enlightening to understand more about the nature of the material, which is fundamental to any understanding of medieval Italian sculpture. Our next speaker is a colleague coming from the Goethe Universität in Frankfurt am Main in Germany, Assistant Professor Rebecca Müller. She has her PhD studies from the Philipps Universität in Marburg in Germany, but has spent a great deal of time in Italy and in Florence studying various topics of medieval Italian sculpture problems, although she's more recently has been working on a publication that came out on Giorgio Vasari, so her interests are quite diverse. This afternoon she will be examining a topic that is quite a great interest for the foundations of of Renaissance imagery, as its title says there on the screen, Rethinking a Medieval Portrait Bust in Italy. Rebecca.
Thank you very much for your kind words of introduction, Charles. I feel exceptionally privileged to speak on the occasion of the publication of the Metropolitan Museum's catalogue on medieval Italian sculpture. I would accordingly like to extend my compliments and my heartfelt congratulations to Lisbeth Castelnuovo-Tedesco and Jack Soultanian for having accomplished this eminent publication. And I want to express my deep gratitude to Peter Barnet and Charles Little for inviting me to present some thoughts on the medieval portrait bust in Italy. If we look up the lemma bust in the Dictionary of Art, we learn that, and I quote, the rebirth of the three-dimensional busts relates to the increasing value attached to relics in Europe during the late Middle Ages, and that, here I quote again, during the 15th century, the sculptured portrait bust was revived at first in Florence. As an example of the Florentine Renaissance bust alluded to in the article, I show the famous piece attributed to Desiderio da Settignano in Berlin. With a truncation through the chest and arms, the detailed rendering of idealized maidenly traits, the gracious but unaffected expression and movement, which in the ostensible animation of the figure both engage and delude the beholder, it's only marble, not flesh. It exhibits the typical characteristics of a rather coherent group of early Renaissance busts, in this case female. The statement cited a moment ago corresponds to the familiar idea that after the end of antiquity, the portrait bust is an innovation of the 15th century. At first sight, this concept seems to be supported by the fact that the artworks discussed as medieval portrait busts proved to be less consistent than their followers. The problem of defining formal criteria for the typology of the genre bust thus poses itself. Let me cite a few examples. The two portraits of Popes Boniface VIII and Benedict XII in Rome were attributed a special role as half-length figures. As so to speak, special cases were also considered busts in the architectural context, famous examples being the busts that represent Peter Parlour and 20 other personages in Prague Cathedral. This leads us to the problem of autonomy regarding both form and function that arises in connection with these busts. This is best exemplified by the bronze head of a sovereign, the so-called Kappenberg head. In a contemporary source, it is referred to as having been, quote, shaped after the visage of the emperor, that is Frederick I Barbarossa. That is, thus, it clearly was intended as a likeness of a living person. Let me cite just a few scholarly comments. The head was assessed as a substitutional effigy of Christ, Susanne Wittekind, as a pseudo-aquamanile, Michel, as the likeness of an emperor whose identity was probably consciously left vague and was therefore interchangeable between its archetype Charles the Great and its contemporary counterpart, namely Frederick Barbarossa, Ursula Nilgen, as the beginnings of the autonomous portrait bust stuck halfway, Adolf Reinle, and as the first portrait bust after the end of antiquity, Wolfgang Schneider. My aim here is not to decide which of these randomly chosen statements best hit the mark. Rather, I should like to make clear how controversial the objects in question are. We become even more aware of the problem of definition when we read some description of the bust of Boniface, which you can still see on the left. Angela Maria Romanini saw in it, quote, the stupefying ambiguities of character and mood of one of the most ambitious and complex personalities of the medieval West, captured in one of the most modern portraits of the Middle Ages. Quite to the contrary, for Joachim Peschke, it is, quote, not a portrait bust in its proper sense, because the main interest does not lie in rendering the individual traits, but in the visualization of the office. These are good illustration of the problems that come up when rather subjective criteria are applied to a bust without being specified beforehand. On the whole, the question that arises here is that of the divergent present-day concepts of the medieval individual and of the possibility of its representation in a medieval artwork. The diversity of perspectives become even more evident when we look at the categories used in relation to the Kappenberg head. Nilden, for instance, refers to it as reaching, quote, the limits of the universally accepted and even the explosiveness of the object. And obviously, the assessment of the genre as a whole, indeed the very question of its existence, depends on the interpretation of its individual examples. Harald Keller formulated in the antithesis to the opinion that portrait busts are a Quattrocento innovation. In 1939, in a seminar article on the portrait in the Middle Ages, when discussing the revival of antiquity promulgated by Emperor Frederick II, he declared, at the outset, the most important manifestation of the antique sculpted portrait was revived, the bust. Quoting Keller, in an equally famous contribution, Irving Levin took it for granted that the medieval portrait bust was to be seen side by side with reliquary busts as forerunners to the Renaissance portrait bust. In his opinion, with a horizontal cut through the chest, the canonical form was already established in the Middle Ages. In retrospect, the conclusions drawn by the two scholars seem less convincing. For the only bust discussed in depth by Keller and mentioned by Levin as an important example is this armed man from Acerenza in southern Italy. This bust, however, for reason I cannot discuss here, presumably dates from early modern times, a view advanced by, among others, Valentino Pace. And the Acerenza bust shares this fate of scholarly expulsion from the circle of medieval artworks with other similar pieces. Does that mean that there were indeed no medieval portrait bust? I don't think so. Against the background sketched above, however, the case of the Acerenza bust makes it clear that art history is obligated to review its objects critically first, before reaching what may be premature conclusions on the genre as a whole. And in the context of the problem of the medieval portrait, its autonomy, its individuality, we should not fail to see the medieval bust in the longue durée of the genre, that is, to judge it also by criteria normally applied to the bust of early modern times. Here I'm thinking especially of the relationship to the spectator and the possibilities of embodiment and animation. The medieval bust thus awaits reassessment, an undertaking for which this paper naturally only claims to offer an impulse. I should like to discuss the problem based on three Italian artworks which in the attempt to define a typology of the bust genre were widely neglected. On the basis of a formal analysis of these works and a few further comparisons, my aim is to shed light on the artistic and historical conditions under which they were conceived. In doing so, I will argue that their cultural context, that is, southern Italy in the later 13th century, is distinguished by a remarkable multitude of monuments that combine the portrait of a historical personality with a bust format. Finally, some remarks regarding their possible meaning will lead to the topic of the aesthetics of reception, which I believe is wrongly neglected when it comes to the medieval bust. This life-size marble bust of a crowned woman is to be found in the Cathedral of Ravello, situated on the Amalfitanian coast south of Naples. To the museum goers of the Metropolitan Museum, she's well known as she was part of the impressive set-in-stone exhibition 3 years ago. Her face is turned a little toward her left, her lips are slightly parted. While the floral crown, the long earrings, and the jewel borders of her dress catch the eye in the front view, the back surprises the viewer with 2 braids. Some areas are not fully elaborated. At the same time, some details, the abrupt ending of the braids, for instance, or the bust's irregular edges, display signs of later recutting. Until the year 1972, this bust was installed on the right-hand pulpit of the cathedral, a position probably attested for the first time in 1540. Fortunately, we know the date, donor, and artist of this liturgical furnishing, since two inscriptions declare that it was made by the marmorarius Nicola di Bartolomeo da Foggia in 1272 and donated by the patrician Nicola Ruffolo of Ravello. Especially the comparison of the bust's crown with the ornaments of the pulpit makes it plausible that Nicola da Foggia was also the author of the bust, an argument which cannot be discussed here in detail. Yet this insight does not reveal anything about the possible functional connection between the two monuments. Indeed, most scholars object to the idea that the bust was originally part of the pulpit. The recut edges of the bust and its crude installation, you can see this on the left, without any socle, representing the most important arguments. Since the 19th century, another female marble bust has been compared to the Ravello head. At that time, though not originally, this slightly smaller than life-size bust was to be found decorating a house in Scala, a small town near Ravello. Wilhelm Bode acquired it for the Berlin Museum, but it was probably destroyed in World War II. While only 2 photographs of the bust exist, a plaster mold has survived, so we still can examine the back, at least that of the plaster cast. The woman's turned slightly toward her left, their eyes gazing ahead. 2 braids, crossed in the back, support a circlet with erect acanthus foliage. Her dress shows jeweled edgings, and a cloak recalling an antique type of outwear, the pala, is draped around her shoulders. The bust was conceived for a frontal view, as the marble is only roughly cut on the back. It was mutilated in some areas, especially on the slighted parted lips. Another female bust was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum in 1947. The piece consisted of 2 rather ill-fitting parts, since slightly than life-size head, you can see here, was affixed on a later bust, from which it since has been detached. The head also shows a woman wearing a circlet with acanthus foliage, resting on 2 plates arranged crosswise at the nape of her neck. As analyzed by Jack Soultanian, the head suffered greatly from exposure to water and was subjected to some recutting and later addition, such as the lapis lazuli insets embellishing the circlet. How can we characterize the artistic relationship between the 3 women? The New York head shares the arrangement of the braids with the Scala bust. The hairdo of the Ravello piece can be distinguished as a variant in which the braids fall over the shoulders. The circlets in New York and Berlin concur in the acanthus motif, the latter also exhibiting the stylized and for the most part unelaborated buds of the Ravello crown. The busts from Ravello and Scala correlate in style, in the proportioning of the massive faces with high cheeks, the sharp cutting of the eyes and brows, the drilled corners of the mouth, the remarkably visible teeth, and the likewise remarkable wrinkles on the fleshy necks. This said, the Ravello woman is characterized by more elaborate execution. The drill has been used more systematically to articulate the strands of hair and accentuate its plasticity with shadowy areas, whereas in the ex-Berlin piece, the drill bit was applied differently, that is, to isolated individual spots, one after another, in a manner serving to dissolve the hair structure. Except for the dresses, both the style and motifs of the 3 pieces derive largely from Roman sculpture, especially the high, flat cheeks, the long, sharply cut brows, overarching cavernous eyes, hark back to antique prototypes. They all feature the motif of an isolated, curled wisp of hair in front of the ear. It was also in antique sculpture that artists could study the use of the drill to mark the corners of the mouth. As Dorothy Glass already made lucid in her lecture before, antique sculptures were fairly easily accessible, whether on buildings that had survived antiquity or as spolia reused in medieval structures. Even more than the affinity to antique artworks, however, What is surprising here is the format, the formal definition of the bust contours, as preserved only in the ex-Berlin piece. Visually speaking, this bust is not determined by an abrupt horizontal cut through the chest. Maybe this is better to see. Visually speaking, this bust is not determined by an abrupt horizontal cut through the chest, as seen in the 15th century bust. Instead, it is defined by the close transverse oval of the pala. Thus, the bust does not appear as a fragment of the body, but forms a self-contained whole. We find possible models for this solution, that is to say, busts not representing a horizontal truncated body, but a self-contained form, in antique sculpture, as in the monumental busts on the Antique Theatre in Capua, but also on sarcophagi. Especially common was the bust in the round format, the Imago Clypeata, that you see here in the fine capitals reused in the Norman Cathedral of Monreale in Sicily. Antique busts had been perceived and emulated already some decades earlier in the very same region, that is Campania, and we saw this example before too. The city gate erected in Capua by Frederick II, now largely destroyed, presented three imposing busts in their tondi. According to a rather careless later drawing, the front of the Capuan gate was dominated by a colossal, more than twice life-size female bust, which, on the basis of a related inscription, is probably to be interpreted as a personification of justice. Only her opposing head, though mutilated, survived. She was flanked by two larger-than-life-size busts of bearded men, and you saw this before too. The latter, in their position on the gate and in their format as busts in the round, directly emulate the tondi on Roman gates and arches. In questions of style, however, the coats knotted at the center and elaborated in flat, ornamental drapery deviate from antique models. In this respect, they also differ strongly from the Scala bust. Instead, with regard to the representation of the garments, a parallel is found in this slightly smaller than life-size fragment of a marble bust in Bari, discovered in the 19th century beneath the tympanum of the portal of Frederick II's Castel del Monte in Apulia. The manner in which the garment is gathered at the shoulders does not adhere exactly to antique models, but by virtue of its pala-like cloak draped in the round in a manner strongly emulating antique drapery, this example bears closer a resemblance to antique bust than any other medieval bust I know of. What can we conclude from the comparison between the three busts themselves, the bust of Frederick's time and antique sculpture? The three women obviously form a group, but since they differ in size and in some motifs, they did not belong to one and the same decoration program. To a large extent, they adopted an antique manner of employing forms, but at the same time it is clear that they were not meant as imitation of antique sculptures which did exist at the time, since their crowns and their jeweled dresses do not adhere to antique prototypes. It is only the Scala bust that conveys the bust format in its plain form. The others, we will recall, are damaged at their bases. In this respect, the Scala bust is closest to the bust in Bari. Thus, the form defined by Levin as canonical for the medieval bust, namely the horizontal truncation exhibited in the bust of Pope Boniface, is only one formal solution among others. Against this background, I would like to suggest a reconstruction of the Ravello bust, which at this point is only a hypothesis. At the place where the shoulders would have been, the bust is broken, and the breaks can be observed not only on the side, as could be expected, but also on the front. And this is difficult to discern on a photograph. I put these small arrows there. These edges mark the recutting of a form that originally projected over the dress. Here, a pala could have been draped around the bust, perhaps in a manner comparable to that seen in the bust from Scala. Concerning the date of the three women, it is still the Ravello pulpit we looked at earlier that provides a point of reference. Given its certain date of 1272, I would argue that the bust should also be dated in the 1270s without further narrowing down the period. This would mean that they were executed in the early years of the domination of the Anjou dynasty, a period strongly characterized by the continuation of artistic traditions handed down from the Hohenstaufen period. Who is represented in these female busts? The point of departure for their identification has always been the bust in Ravello, since the inscription of the pulpit refers to its donor Nicola Ruffolo as the husband of Sigelgaita, and the bust accordingly went down in literature as Sigelgaita. Objections were raised early on, however, and this bust, and thus the other two as well, was designated Mary, Mother of God. Other authors gave the subject an allegorical meaning and identified her as Mater Ecclesia, the personification of the Church. In view of the crown, yet another conjecture is that the bust is a personification of the city of Ravello, or perhaps even bore both of these latter meanings. Joukowski, in her fundamental contribution on artistic patronage in the region of Amalfi, sees the bust as the city of Ravello, comparable to a no longer extant personification of the city of Amalfi, to which they had discovered references. To what extent do these interpretations hold up in view of the bust's iconography? In my opinion, already the different hairdos and the lack of attributes other than the headdresses, an absence we can reconstruct on the basis of the Scala bust, disprove the figure's identifications as Mary or Ecclesia. The most important point, however, seems to me to be the format of a more or less life-sized bust fully sculpted in the round. There is a tradition of southern Italian representations of the crowned and heavily jeweled Mary as queen, as well as of Ecclesia, but that tradition had reached its peak in the period before the 13th century. What is more, the depictions were painted and showed the figure's full length. How then is the reading as city personification to be assessed? The figure of Amalfi was described in the early modern source cited by Casque as an enthroned crowned woman characterized by a golden globe in her right hand and a lion crouching on her lap. She was represented in a painting on view in the hall where the patricians of Amalfi assembled. With respect to this rather special iconography, however, is it possible to construe in the same way a figure of a woman differing in most iconographic features, that is, lacking the attributes, adhering to a different typology, and executed in a different medium? I would propose adopting a different approach, which is by no means a new one, but which, in my opinion, has neither been sufficiently elucidated nor in its consequences specified. In the 1380s, Ronald Lightbone was the first scholar to contemplate the popular reading of the bust in Ravello as Sigelgaita and combine this concept explicitly with the hypothesis of a profane function. The women's headdresses do not reproduce sovereign insignia. Based on this fact, the author pointed out sumptuary laws and contemporary descriptions of court festivals documented that crowns and circlets were also worn by non-royal women in imitation of the queen. This was probably a French fashion introduced by the Angevin court. Lightbone accordingly saw the female bust as representing the wives of the heads of the leading families on the Amalfitanian coast, that is, families such as the Ruffolo. Nouveau riche for the most part, these families had become extremely wealthy and influential as merchants in far-reaching trade activities, some of them even possessing entire ship fleets, and as high-ranking Angevin officials. In conclusion, Lightbone saw in these busts, quote, a revival of an antique form of domestic portraiture that precedes by nearly 200 years its revival in Renaissance Florence, following the tradition of the family imagines of ancient Rome. Today, one could push this argument even further, as Ingo Herklotz was able to show that the Roman custom to display family portraits in the private house was indeed known to authors of the 13th century. But the objection could be raised that the documented wearing of circlets does not automatically mean that it was possible to depict that custom, especially in the sculpture medium. It is particularly conspicuous that in ancient Naples we find some examples of non-royal women being represented on their tomb slabs in a special way. They wear jeweled dresses, luxurious earrings, and crowns. These tomb images appear as a perpetuated infringement against sumptuary laws. The most important question, however, is still that of typology. Are there other portrait busts dating from the same period that are comparable to the female busts under discussion here? We should begin by ruling out nearly a dozen primarily male busts whose medieval origin is doubtful, as in the case of the armed man of Acherenza we saw earlier, or whose designation as a portrait is controversial, as is the case with the bust from the Capuan Gate. Likenesses in the form of busts are more readily found outside the medium of monumental sculpture. The motif of the bust all'antico in Italy had its wise propagation in the high-quality gold coinage of Frederick II, referred to as Augustales, and we were shown this example too before. These coins circulated widely from 1230 onwards and were explicitly minted and to propagate the emperor's name and appearance. He was shown, as already stated by his contemporaries, in the form of ancient sovereigns. It was after the example of these coins that Charles I of Anjou modeled his own gold coinage following the fall of the Hohenstaufen. Instead of the antique motif of the laurel crest, he chose a medieval crown, but he adopted the bust form, which thus remained prominent. And as you can see in the right-hand image, the portrait bust in profile also became popular outside the sovereign sphere, especially on seals like the one belonging to Processo Capucci. These, in my view, are the conditions for the introduction of the relief portrait bust into the sculptural decoration of southern Italian monuments. An example rather neglected to date is the richly decorated canopy tomb, probably of Riccardo Falcone, in the Apulian town of Bisceglie near Bari. Here we find two busts in relief of a male and, on the left, that is on the rear side of the canopy, of a female figure, pictured in the antique manner as heads emerging from acanthus leaf calyxes. Very likely they show Falcone and his wife. This assumption is supported by the context in which the busts are to be seen. A row of shields with the canting arms of the Falcone family showing a falcon are part of the tomb's exuberant tracery, and these shields are flanked by the two busts. Two media of visual self-representation, portraits and heraldry, are thus strikingly combined in a mutually complementary manner. This combination characterizes another monument, the Ravello pulpit itself. Its door, through which the priest ascended to the lectern, is flanked by two busts. Facing each other, they overlap their frames, that is, the spandrels of the trefoiled arched portal. The figures are shown in such a high relief that when they are viewed obliquely, both eyes are visible. The fashionable contemporary hairstyles and costumes identify them as well-to-do men, wearing a hood of a thin fabric, allowing his ear to show through, and most probably his wife. Interestingly, the female profile exhibits the same type of hairdress as the bust from Scala and the New York head. Most authors have convincingly seen in the two Ravello profiles the donors of the pulpit, that is Nicola di Ruffolo and his wife, Sigel Gaeta. This is especially plausible since the inscription attesting the donation appears just around the corner on the wall of the staircase. Thus, the Ruffolo placed the likenesses in the tradition of donor portraits which support their plea for salvation. Yet there are no immediate prototypes either for the placement of the donor's portrait in combination with both the magnificence of the donated monument and its liturgical significance, or, above all, for the bust form. The rufolo are further represented on the pulpit in another important medium already mentioned earlier. On the tessellated side facing the entrance to the cathedral, we find the armorial bearings consisting of a shield with fleur-de-lis and diagonal stripes depicted twice, once on each side of an image of the Virgin and Child. On the same side, beneath the lectern to the left of an altar niche, today largely restored and thus shown here in an earlier drawing, 8 of these shields are lined up along the pilaster. As emphasized by Casquet, the rufolo armorials are the earliest extant family arms on the Amalfi Coast. In the context of princely auto-representation, the Anjou dynasty was the first among the southern Italian rulers to use heraldry in a systematic way. The rufolo thus followed the example of the new rulers in heraldry as well. The armorial imagery was combined with the donor's inscription and realized on an important liturgical furnishing in the main church of Ravello. This enormous privilege was undoubtedly granted by the bishop to one of the wealthiest and most influential families on the Amalfitanian coast. Within the context of this lecture, I could do no more than catch a major chapter in the history of art patronage in medieval Italy. In our context, however, the pictorial program of the Ravello pulpit is most significant since it illustrates the manner in which sculpture, used in 13th century southern Italy for a new type of imagery and unconventional modes of representation, could take on an experimental character. Here we can draw a parallel to the sepulchral monument of the Falcone in Apulia, which of course has a different function, but pursues comparable visual strategies. With its serial use of families' heraldry, it similarly demonstrates the endeavor of an elite of officials and financiers to invent novel forms of representations for themselves. The portrait bust reliefs on both monuments can be assessed in this context. In place of a detailed comparison, however, I would like to use this example to highlight the following circumstance: that portraits in bust form with variable characteristics and invariable functions gain presence in the immediate ambit of the 3 sculptures analyzed earlier. Nothing of the kind can be claimed of busts of Mary, Ecclesia, or city goddesses whose existence remain putative. On the Amalfitanian coast, a shallow stratum of families gained wealth and then political influence and were relied upon first by the Hohenstaufen and then by the Anjou as high officials. In their art patronage practices, new modes of representation were developed to articulate their status to others, as Casquet demonstrated especially in their splendid domestic architecture, which echoes princely architecture around the Mediterranean. It was in this historical and cultural environment that, in my view, it was possible to adopt the portrait bust in a monumental format, that is, in sculpture carved almost completely in the round. Without speculating about the actual identities of the persons represented, I have accordingly come to the conclusion that, on the basis of the present state of research, in other words, without any information about the functional or visual context of display, the interpretation of the busts as historical persons, that is, as female members of these families, is the most plausible. But to be clear, it would be anachronistic to look for a veristic resemblance in these busts, as they are obviously idealized. In the period in question, portrait can be understood as a representation of a specific person, but not a depiction of his or her personal physiognomic traits. As Thomas Dale convincingly has argued for 12th century portraits, they, too, respond to a different set of expectations. The question remains as to what concept was linked with the genre of the bust, why antiquity was adopted in this way. As regards southern Italy, the decisive stimulus might have been Frederick's widespread Augustalis and his Capuan Gate, where the politically, ideologically motivated emperor adopted numerous means of self-representation from ancient sovereigns, thus using art to spread a secular memoria as a form of propaganda. The utilization of the bust beyond the imperial sphere suggests that, in the cultural context sketched above, it was understood as an adequate means of ostentatiously representing the status, namely that of a family or individual. Why have only 3 female busts survived? Of course, this might be an accident of preservation, and we should ask how families could have come to be represented by their female members at all. Quite as much as for the modern viewer, the crowns and the jewels were probably also striking features for the contemporaries. As was the case in the Neapolitan tomb slab shown earlier, these luxury goods might have been a means of indicating the family's wealth, even if they did not depict real jewelry possessed by the woman in question. Status would thus be expressed here by the prestige of ostentatious consumption, but it would be the status of the family rather than that of the individual. Previous analysis of these busts have only rarely reflected on the visual means to which they owe a, so to speak, lifelike appearance. I should thus like to conclude with a fresh look at some of the piece's formal characteristics. Wilhelm Valentiner, a former employee of the Berlin Museum and long director of the Detroit Art Institute, had the opportunity to study the original of the bust from Scala. He emphasized its special, quote, directness and momentaneous expression, which makes her much more alive and much nearer to a real portrait than the Ravello bust. Jane Schuyler, discussing the forerunners to the Florentine bust, comes to a similar conclusion when she says of the Ravello bust that she is a, quote, idealized, suggesting that she is not a portrait, while the Scala bust is more individualized and likely to be a portrait. The impression the Ravello bust made on these scholars can partly be traced to the manner in which it was represented in photographs, that is, in such a way as to accentuate symmetry and austerity. You see on the right an example in an extremely popular German textbook. That is, and these qualities that are underlined here are sought in vain in the actual sculpture. But this idea gains undue significance in the analysis of the details. Valentiner evaluates the drill as a decisive means of, quote, enlivening the outlines of the Berlin bust, whereas the sculpture of the Ravello piece, in his words, seldom uses the drill. As I tried to show earlier, however, the latter does not use the drill as frequently, but in a different way. And precisely the feature cited by Valentiner as characteristic of the bust from Scala, quote, the drill holes which mark the ends of the mouth, is found in identical manner on the Ravello bust as well. Given their closeness to an ancient sculpture, both busts are comparably far from an individualizing concept of mimesis. What seems important to me is that, despite their idealization, the busts adopt signs of an embodied presence, since both of them, with their open mouth revealing their teeth, make reference to a common formula of praising the quality of an artwork, that is, the antique topos of liveliness. The early 15th century erudite Guarino da Verona would later formulate the dialectic of this seeming animatio of a sculptured work of art with the words, when I look at an open mouth, I expect a voice to come from the damp. The slight turn of the head, which causes an impression of momentariness, the hollows between the clavicles, and the wrinkles in the skin of the neck likewise evoke an animated body. These traits were already long familiar in ancient reliefs, but to adopt them in the sculptural context of the bust was a novelty. What might be the implications of these observations? While a full-length sculpted figure creates distance to the spectator by representing a whole-bodied, self-contained other, a bust depicting a person in a three-dimensional close-up which omits the body, allows a form of intimacy between the beholder and the subject. The concentration on the face and the accordingly wide spectrum of possible emotional projections are intrinsic to the bust format. As the original placement of the busts under discussion here is entirely unclear, and therefore the questions as to a possible communicative exchange with the viewer and as to how the busts were perceived in a specific environment must remain unsolved for the time being. The evaluation of this very early combination of the genre's inherent concentration on the face with the obvious indications of likeliness on that face thus also remains difficult. In this talk, I tried to show why the questions we took as our point of departure, whether or not the sculpted portrait bust did exist in the Middle Ages, deserve an affirmative answer. The busts shown earlier are examples of the wide spectrum of variations on the bust motif in this period, which makes it difficult and, in my view, rather unreasonable to judge them according to categories such as autonomy or physiognomic likeness. The characteristics I put forward in my discussion shed light on the process of reception and the power of innovation which came to bear in 13th century southern Italian sculpture on the one hand, and on the effective need of an elite for adequate forms of status representation. It was on this basis that an antique genre of representation could be adopted and transformed for use in a new context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. We have a few concluding remarks by our longtime friend of the Metropolitan Museum, Valentino Pace, who is also concurrently, like Dorothy Glass, the Richard Krautheimer Professor at the Bibliotheca Hertziana in Rome. When he's not in Rome doing that, he is Professor of Art History at the University in Udine. And he will have a few concluding remarks.
Thank you, Chuck. And beyond thanking the Metropolitan Museum as an institution, I must really say a word of thanks for my long-standing friend Chuck, Dr. Little, not only since he invited me here to join this nice opportunity, this nice symposium, but also since he made possible a wider discussion on the topic of Italian medieval sculpture. And there I feel a little bit patriottico. I'm happy that Italy and Italian medieval sculpture is the focus of research of such a great institution as the Metropolitan Museum. Obviously, thanks are due also to Lisbeth Castelnuovo-Tedesco and Jacques Soultanian for their achievement. Chuck has also made a splendid choice for today's lectures and has invited a little but very meaningful range of scholars of long standing, just a celebrità as Dorothy, our emerita, and emerging, if I may say, scholars as Rebecca, and then obviously Lorenzo Lazzarini as the great specialist of stone conservation, and my good friend Pierre-Yves Le Pogam of the Louvre, who has such a splendid balanced knowledge of European sculpture, since perhaps some of you does not know that he is curator of the French department, but is a specialist of Italian art, medieval art, which is an excellent point. When Chuck sent me the first letters about this program, then he surveyed the different stages, and then there was an expression which I did not immediately understand. I know what is B&B is, bed and breakfast, but I did not know what is A and Q. I realized later there's answers and questions. And so I think I should also, my duty here is also to raise to the audience to make some comments and raise some questions. For doing that, perhaps just few observations, if I may, to the different lectures. And, well, the first one of Dorothy could have been labeled also in a more traditional way, artist patronage and religion. Who, what is, I don't remember now what is who, what, when, and there was a fourth W. And clearly, with her knowledge of the matter, she has made very clear survey of the different components and the most important requisites for Italian medieval sculpture. I would say, well, obviously 35 minutes are not long enough for investigating the all aspects of this topic. She focused also on the presence of the signatures, Lanfranco and Viligelmo, and this topic is very important nowadays with a larger awareness of the role of the artist, especially after this monumental achievement by, I don't remember now the name of our colleague of Regensburg, Albert Dietl, the 4 volumes on signatures. Obviously, perhaps there may be someone who wants to ask more about the awareness of the sculptures of the artist, how this issue has come to the fore in the medieval art, so that I just make a point for discussion. Another one, Dorothy has written extensively on the relation on liturgy and sculpture, and this is a topic which embraces also monuments which, as the wooden groups of the descent from the cross in the Met, you have just 2 mourners, but missing the central part. But this is another important point for any discussion of medieval art. The relation of the sculpture in general with the Sacre Conversazioni, and how the faithful have perceived the reality of the settings and have been their emotions have been directly struck by viewing these works. And then another point, perhaps, which Dorothy has done at the very end, about the implication, the ideological implication and background of the, let us say, Italian medieval world. Here, I don't know whether if I totally agree with Dorothy. Even perhaps we do agree, but she has said in a way that I don't feel so, I'm not so confident. It's clear, she says, I'd taken the notes, Italian medieval art is more earth-centered than heaven-centered, more human and less theological. It speaks to the citizens of the early communes as they go about their business in urban centers, and it also speaks to those in rural settings. I would like the audience to pick up this point. I think once a monument as Parma Baptistry, which Dorothy herself is now studying, or the Fontana di Perugia, or other ones, when we take these monuments, I would hardly believe that Italian medieval art is more human and less theological. So this would be just 3 points, but many more could be discussed. I ask the motor of all this day whether he would like to get discussion on each paper, or shall I give and then back? So, yeah, okay. Then, as far the second, also, I liked very much this focusing on Ruskin, and to make us understand, I'd never reflected on this phenomenon, but I think it came out very clear, the importance of Ruskin for the appreciation of medieval sculpture beyond Italy, the importance of the Middle Ages for Italy, for the average Italian scholar or average Italian learned public, as the first step to the Renaissance. A terrible mistake which has which can be seen within the field of other great mistakes, which means Vasari's view of Byzantine art, the awful deviations of certain Tuscan scholars who believe that everything has been born in Florence, and there is just a dark side before. So I appreciated this approach, which covers sculpture and painting in this case, and makes us clear the reason for this phenomenon in a way. Then I would add perhaps one specific example to this collection of examples which Pierre-Yves has given us as early museums. I would say, as an adoptive Roman in a way, we must not forget the great museological setting which any church of the 16th, 17th century with antiquarianism has created in the porches of the church. So, San Crisogono, Santa Maria in Trastevere, Sant'Agnese in the staircase. Every church during the antiquarianism times, let us think of Cassiano del Pozzo, Panvino, whoever, every church has made a special point of showing that its past was in the early Christian times, and so this ideological relation with the past, with this ideological relation with the past, had to be proven, and the antiquities were displayed at the entrance of the church so that anyone, even entering a church which had been refurbished, could see that indeed it was old. And so this is also a way of appreciating the past and create a memory of the past. And, well, le jeu du marché, it will be splendid if Louvre, Metropolitan, and other could go ahead with the study of the great collezionisti. Brummer. I remember, perhaps she has arrived, a very good friend of mine, Elizabeth Smith, who has published a very interesting study on the American collectionism of medieval art. I think really a very deep in research on this, on the works, not only on the collectionism, on the works which have been gathered and bought by this Brummer and so on, for the history, if I may say, of the fakes. Since I have some interest with Frederick II, and every year I get at least 2 fakes, which whose photographs reach me, and I'm always forced to say, well, I in a very nice way, I must say, they are very interesting, but they don't seem to me 13th century. And and I think really an international net should be created for the study of all those sculptures. Some of them may even be genuine, but how this phenomenon took place, how it was created, what was the importance of certain ideology for Germany, lavish Kasnis von Weinberg, and the myth of Frederick II, and the need of creating a pattern of images which could respond to this feeling of Frederick II, of having Frederick II with himself, and also other cases. So it's just an appeal to a great cooperation in this case, to further understand how much. And I must say, Metropolitan Museum I must admire the honesty, I must say, which is really an important point of seriousness, that in the catalogue there are those Langobardic reliefs which are perfectly dated 1970, more or less, and had been bought by the Metropolitan. But I must say, no scholars had even supposed that they could be 20th century works until a younger colleague of Verona didn't get through its traces and found out that they had been sculpted by a very nice sculptor who did these arches, signed himself, and when Bert Brank published, he was good enough to say there must be the monogram of the artist. The point is that the artist didn't live in the 9th, but in the 20th century. And this, I mean, there is the interview of this sculptor, and he put his monogram since he wanted to avoid any process, any claim that he had made fakes. He had signed them, so it didn't hang on him if other people would have understood these letters as proofs of centuries ago. I cannot say anything with Professor Lazzarini's paper. I mean, just admire, envy his knowledge of all the stones. So I think there is just a possibility of asking some further questions about the stones of Venice. I would say that after Ruskin now we have not only Ruskin for the stones of Venice, but also Lorenzo Lazzarini. And last but not least, Rebecca. I'm very happy that Rebecca is here. I had a nice opportunity of speaking the laudatio for Rebecca, who was praised with an important award in Florence last year. And I find that she has highlighted in a very convincing way the line of development, the reasons why this type of artistic sculptural creation has come back to light, has been developed. I'm particularly proud since she has focused so much on the importance of South Italy, and I'm a South Italian. I'm very happy about that. And but I will have a question for her, since at his time, when we will come to the discussion, since that enigma Kappenberg. So she mentioned Kappenberg, but then disappeared. So when we come to the point, I would like her to say some words about Kappenberg. How does she interpret Kappenberg head and how she posits this head within her scheme of reconstruction? As well as, I think she said that she has proposed a reconstruction of the Ravello. What a pity that you didn't show us the full. But I don't know whether you have a slide to show us, or tomorrow perhaps. Anyway, so just this. So these were these 4 excellent papers. At this point, I think I should leave the word to the audience and ask for the comments or for questions, but I think Chuck perhaps comes here and helps in case of problems, language problems.
Good. Yes, there are microphones on the aisles. If anybody has any question, maybe stand up and speak clearly and slowly for the benefit of our speakers, and they'll try to answer some of your questions if you have any.
Starting with Professor Glass, possibly, certainly there are certain curiosità. If there is not it's always different, the first question. So I go back to my question to Dorothy about her last issue, which was
earthly versus
earthly versus divine, or so on. Perhaps Dorothy will, and so perhaps in this way we break the silence.
Okay, Valentino, I think you're right to catch me. I have to catch this. I think you're right to catch me out in a broad generalization, but that said, I would stick by my point, and I would use as an example of what I would call a typical French monument, something like the right portal of the west facade of the cathedral at Chartres, which is organized around the theological theme of the incarnation of Christ, and where the liberal arts there are used as a path to the knowledge of Christ, not shown, for instance, at ground level. So, and I think one could elicit many more other examples in France. For example, the facade of Amiens Cathedral, which is an orchestrated whole from local saint to virgin to Christ, and then down below all those wonderful smaller scenes that show the terrestrial world. And I think that in Italy, that is far less so. Well, I'll challenge you. Can you think of any facade in Italy that's at all like French Gothic facades? We've been friends for 40 years. We can do this.
I was going to ask Valentino the same question. Can you come up with an Italian facade that has that kind of total orchestration leading up almost to a single point? But I also interpreted Dorothy's comments in terms of the sculptural forms, where in Italy they are really individuals, in a sense disconnected dramatically from the architectural framework of which they're a part, whereas in France, the figures are, I forgot how you worded it, Dorothy, they are subordinate, they are dependent entirely on the architectural setting. Those, not entirely, but to a large extent, but the figures in Florence Cathedral, they really project out and they kind of talk to the observer down below. They communicate with each other, but to some extent with the observers, and then that is continued in the 15th century with the figures from Or San Michele that are, practically at ground level and talk to the passerby on the street.
I would just make one point. I don't know whether we are allowed to deal within this kind of problems. Can we remain within the field of sculpture alone? I think this should be dealt with a wider context, and at that point, if we think as Anagni, the Gothic room in Rome, and all the plans of frescoes of the 13th century, we see that there is a certainly strong intellectual ideological trend. So I perfectly understand what Dorothy says. Obviously, I know that when I compare what I used to do with my students, when I compare San Lorenzo fuori le mura with ramps, I think that there is something missing in San Lorenzo fuori le mura. But it's a question, this cannot be perhaps justified with those very words, probably. I don't know which word I would have used, obviously. But it's such a different reality. Here's the question of Rome and of the impact of Rome on the whole medieval art in Italy, first of all. I must say that in the last 20 or 30 years, it has been done an enormous advancement in the understanding of the importance of Rome in the medieval art. And this covers a wider field, and the models of Rome, be it St. Peter, be it St. Peter's or other churches, shows that there was another ideological approach to the great truths of the church. And for this reason, I would humbly object what Dorothy said.
Well, I think when we talk about Rome, what we have to keep in mind all the time, of course, is it is the papacy, the home of the papacy. All the ideological issues having to do with the papacy and its power all originate out in this way. And I would say that because of this concentration on the church as an institution, Italian iconography is often different because that point is emphasized more than it is in Northern Europe, I think. But to be continued. Everyone else has that chance.
I had two questions for Professor Müller.
No, just a moment. Let's go first through the order, and Rebecca was the last one.
I know.
Yeah? Can we do it?
No.
You must be away.
No. Go ahead. Answer the question. What's that?
Okay.
You sure? I don't want to
Go ahead.
The order is.
First, I wanted to know what kind of sculptor would have been doing those images of the women. And secondly, you said that your hypothesis or your belief was that it was a status enhancer to have the portraits of the women. What would the relative expense of that have been compared to other things, such as if they were non-royal women or didn't have, if they were local people, compared to what, say, gems or a new house or a second house, or what comparative would that be? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for your question, which I think meets in this whole field of gender, also in the Italian sculpture, which is, of course, very important. For the sculptures, for the artists, I think these were the very same that did the other works, just they did what they were asked to do and what they were paid. So I would do know, if I understood your question right, I think they were just the same artists. They were not different artists doing portraiture, in my view. And for the second, this is a very difficult question, of course, because we don't have the sources with these detailed explanations of the cost or everything. So maybe Valentino is better in this, but I couldn't give you an answer for this question, which is an important one. This is clear. But as, for example, the Ruffalo had to pay this pulpit, or did pay the pulpit, which I'm sure was much more expensive, not for the work of the artist, but for the material used, the marble, and especially, porphyry and everything else. I didn't show that at all, but Jilkeski, for example, gave a good explanation on the whole material and this implication of the material, that this was very costly, the pulpit. So I think the sculpture itself was not as expensive as, for example, the pulpit, which really is a very important donation. Sorry, cannot say anything about your really detail. Maybe Christine is best.
I could add just something to that. Very interesting discussion, as I was the one who worked on the piece for the Set in Stone exhibit. And I'm really grateful to Rebecca Müller for raising it again, because there are so many different possible interpretations of this marvelous work and of the three heads. I have to admit I don't quite agree with you, because one question I have is, why was there not a bust of Mr. Ruffalo? Secondly, I do think there is a tradition of these personifications that comes through the Byzantine tradition too. And finally, in terms of expense, it is significant that these Ruffalos, the Ruffalo was the treasurer of Charles of Anjou, and he was both in Apulia as well as in the Amalfi Peninsula, and therefore probably the richest man. I think you suggested that too. So to answer your question, it's a very, very affluent commission. But whether that extends to the others, and now there have been all these other small pieces that have come about, because of course there is also a Palazzo Ruffalo in Ravello. So whether some of the pieces, the small ones that have come about, are from there is another question. Could I ask another question? May I go back to Dorothy and commend her also for her wonderful talk? To Dorothy's wonderful talk and synthesis of it all. And might I just add some small little aspect that you raised with the inscriptions that I think that is so distinctive about Italian early Romanesque sculpture, and how wrong Vasari was, that there is an artist personality, and that you can follow, and this artist personalities are praised, as in, quote, my sculptor, Niccolò, who is praised for centuries to come in the 4 inscriptions that we have, and where you can also trace an oeuvre of an artist that you can't as much in the Northern European situation. And you can even follow some of the Italian sculptors as they travel up north to Chur and Zurich and Königslutter.
Hi, thank you everyone for all of your really interesting talks this afternoon. It was fabulous. I have a question for Professor Lazzarini. And I was really struck by the poetic language that you were using for the description of all the marbles. And I guess I have a two-pronged question from that. First, how much is that language used in the contemporary documents? Like, was there both kind of an awareness of this, I guess specifically the geographic origins that were attached to all of these marbles? And then secondly, if the employment of all of these variety of marbles in a way foreshadowed the imperial ambitions of Venice in any way?
As for the first question, there are very few mentions in ancient documents about the names and the origin of marbles. There is a certain amount of, let's say, tradition going on in Venice through stone cutters, stone masons, and I've learned a lot from them, especially in terms of names, which are very conservative. As for the second question, that was...
well, if indeed there was a kind of awareness in the 12th and 13th century of the origin of all these different marbles, if it was kind of a foreshadowing of Venice's imperial ambitions that really get played out in the 13th and 14th centuries.
use of the stone?
Yes. Yes, sometimes Venice is called the new Byzantium. So they wanted to, imitate Constantinople. And in fact, the choice of situating, for example, porphyry in the basilica, in the topic, places, it's just to emphasize the importance of the building and the importance continue the tradition, because porphyry has the color of purple, and purple is a sign of emperors. So in fact, porphyry is found in the entrance, the main entrance of the basilica, and when you step to enter the basilica, again porphyry is there on the floor. And again, when you step in the transept in front of the main altar. So they are really following what was the use of porphyry in imperial palaces, where the emperor were born in a room which was faced with porphyry. That's why they were called porphyrogenic. And so porphyry was there from the beginning to the end of their life, so they were buried in porphyry. And that is why what I said, that when porphyry was not available, it was substituted by verde antico, and verde antico was probably chosen for the sarcophagus of holding St. Mark. The sarcophagus has been destroyed because the crypt was underwater until a few decades ago. And so the short crystallizing and totally destroyed the sarcophagus already in the 17th century, actually.
Thank you.
I would just add a couple of words again for, who is Rebecca? There. One suggestion, I think, in all your pattern, it could be perhaps useful to introduce the famous bronze statue of Heraclius, since it was very important, very famous, was on site, could be seen, and in my opinion, when you see the upper torso, the bust of Heraclius, it has been almost copied by the Frederick II Barletta bust. So it's interesting within this derivation from it. The second is a little objection to Christine. It's true, obviously, that the Virgin had the model of the crowned women and could be traced back to Byzantium and so on. But we could trace back to Byzantium also those splendid portraits of Zoe or Irene. So why not? I mean, I'm quite inclined to accept Rebecca's argumentation, so I would say also that portrait art could be seen in Byzantium.
Yes. And the crown, the type of crown, it is actually a French crown. But it's the fleur de lis, and then the one that is similar to the synagogue in tracing the crowns, the Met piece and the Berlin Lost piece have a fleur de lis crown, so that would be Angevine. And the one in Ravello is similar, it's different, and it's similar to the one of the French Ecclesia in Strasbourg.
Thank you. This is an old argument between Christine and me. But I would rather say that it's not a fleur de lis, it's a cantus. And I would see this in this tradition of the reception of the antique and rather underline that it's not a real, as Lightbone did, of course, that it's not a real crown. So, but of course I see your point. And at the end we have to say we have nothing from the environment, so it's difficult to decide. I have to admit that.
Okay, is there no question for Pierre-Yves? Or there is a lady down there who has raised a hand.
I have a question for Professor Lazzarini. The 4 tetrarchs, which are porphyry, which are in the corner, I was a little bit late, so did you mention them? And if so, when did the 4 tetrarchs, which are in the corner of San Marco, of porphyry, get put in there?
Yeah. It is most likely after the Fourth Crusade that they arrived, so they were installed soon after. We don't know exactly. But as you know, it's quite clear that they were coming from the Philadelphian, from a palace in Constantinople. And in fact, some years ago, the German excavating the palace found the missing foot, which is now exhibited in the National Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. So the origin is quite certain, and it is really another marking point for the basilica, and recalling again the importance of porphyry. It is not only marking the one side of the basilica, but also the entrance to the Doge's palace, so to the palace of the power, and again connecting Venice with Constantinople and Rome.
One question.
Just one question.
Last question.
This is for Dr. Müller. I'm sorry if it's a little, you're getting all the questions.
Oh, no problem.
I was wondering if you could talk more about embodiment and viewer response in medieval portrait, in Italian medieval portrait bust in general. I wasn't sure if by embodiment you also meant presence, and what kind of response do you actually envision someone having before these busts?
As I underlined, we can, if you think of this as a communication, we lack one part, because we have the busts with all these signs of embodiment that I tried to underline. Also, this is difficult to discern in the photographs, but we know that the bust of Berlin had these wrinkles in the neck, and we can see it also on the photograph of the Ravello head. But we have only these pieces, but as we don't know where they were displayed, if, for example, Christine Brassard proposed that they might be on a gate of the town, so there's nothing of communication, of course. So I would be totally false if this is true, because it's too high. You can't see anything. But for me, it would be. I can just argue from the side of the piece that you have these signs, and I think that they are consciously introduced in the sculpture. So I think they were done for some place where there was a possibility of a sort of communication, of seeing. But it would be purely speculative to go further, and then like we have this we have very good sources for this point for the bust of Renaissance Florence, where we have letters and poems on the busts, so you really can see this exchange. But I wanted to make strong the point that we can't, or in my view, we can't only use the idea of these aesthetics of reception only for the Renaissance monuments, but we have to look clearly also at the medieval pieces and see those traces. But also, if we can't explain them further, and we don't have poems on these or anything of these wonderful sources that we have for the later ones, so I also can't really respond to your answer only by saying we only have the pieces, but we're lacking the other part of the communication. Here.
Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers, to Valentino Pace, for a highly informative afternoon, and to Pierre-Yves, who did not have a question, but I know why, because it was such an exquisitely balanced presentation of the collecting in our time. So we're not like real time, historical time. We have a better grasp of it, and maybe that's part of the reason it was very clear. And thank you very much for your attention this afternoon, and we hope to see you at another event in the very near future. Thanks.